Greetings, quiet chroniclers of historical grime and seekers of uncomfortable truths. Tonight, we're strapping on our sandals and marching straight into the truly unenviable life of a Roman legionary on the frontier. Forget the glorious triumphs in Rome. Imagine endless mud, freezing winters, unwashed barbarians, and the distinct possibility of dying in a ditch thousands of miles from home, all for an emperor who probably didn't know your name. It was less a career and more a really long, very cold, very stabby camping trip, being a frontier legionary. It sucked so spectacularly your worst Monday feels like a triumph. Seriously, prepare for history that's less Ave Caesar and more, oh, for the love of Jupiter, not another patrol, and let it be greater than, and let it be. If this delightfully morbid dive into imperial misery helps you drift off, then you must subscribe and like this video right now. Don't let these ancient blunders go unappreciated. It's the only way this channel can keep bringing you these delightful tales of woe. And as we pack our bags for this perilous journey, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? It's always fascinating to connect with our global community. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a very comfortable pillow because theirs were probably full of hay, and let's ease into tonight's truly miserable history. Close your eyes. Picture a Roman legionary. You see the polished armor, the crimson crest, the eagle's standard held high against a conquered sky. You see a cog in the most efficient and relentless war machine the ancient world had ever known. An agent of empire, a bringer of the Pax Romana through the sharp end of a gladius. This is the image Rome sold to the world and to the poor souls who signed up for 25 years of service. It was a masterpiece of propaganda, a vision of glory, discipline, and absolute power. An image that has captivated us for 2,000 years, standing as a testament to the might of Rome. But for the vast majority of legionaries, this glorious image was a cruel joke. For every day spent in a decisive, history-altering battle, there were 1,000 spent in numbingly dull routine on the empire's edge. Forget the triumphant marches through conquered cities. The real legionary experience was stationed in a damp timber fort at the misty fringes of Germania, or a wind-blasted rock pile in northern Britannia. Turns out, most of their time was spent not winning battles, but just trying not to freeze their toes off. The frontier was less a stage for glory and more a vast open-air prison where the sentence was a quarter-century of mind-numbing tedium and misery. The life of a legionary on the frontier was one of relentless, back-breaking labor. The Roman army was as much a construction company as it was a fighting force. Who do you think built those famous Roman roads that stretched across the empire? Not well-paid contractors. It was the legionaries. They dug ditches, quarried stone, felled entire forests, and built the very forts and walls that would be their homes and their prisons. Day after day was a cycle of sweat, dirt, and exhaustion, all under the watchful eye of a centurion who communicated primarily through creative insults and the sharp sting of his vine staff. This was not the life of a warrior. It was the life of a glorified ditch digger. A long way from home. And what a home it was! The frontiers of the Roman Empire were not selected for their scenic beauty or pleasant climate. Imagine leaving the sun-drenched hills of Italy for the perpetual damp and chilling fog of Britannia, where the sun was a rumour and the rain was your most constant companion. Or perhaps you'd prefer the dense, dark forests of Germania, where every shadow could hide an ambush and the silence was more terrifying than any battle cry. This was a life of profound isolation, hundreds if not thousands of miles from anything resembling Roman civilization. News from home was months old, and the faces you saw every day were the same grim, weary ones as your own. The culinary experience of a frontier legionary was a masterclass in minimalist suffering. The staple of this delightful menu was a wheat biscuit known as panis militaris, a tooth-threateningly hard cracker that was likely more useful as a building material than as a source of nourishment. This would be washed down with posca, a cheap, sour wine mixed with water that was less a refreshing beverage and more a daily reminder of your low station in life. If you were lucky, this gourmet meal might be supplemented with some bland porridge or a stew of whatever questionable meat could be procured. It was a diet designed for survival, not enjoyment, and it perfectly matched the bleakness of the landscape. Of course, there was the ever-present threat of the locals. The so-called barbarians weren't always lining up for a pitched battle. Their presence was more like a constant low-grade infection. A sentry might vanish in the night, a patrol might not return. Small raiding parties would test the defenses, stealing livestock and keeping the garrison on a knife's edge of anxiety. This wasn't the heroic combat of Roman legend. It was a grueling war of attrition against an unseen, ever-present enemy. The psychological toll of living in a state of perpetual, low-level fear, surrounded by a hostile population, was a weapon more potent than any sword. Discipline in the Roman legions was famously brutal, and on the frontier it was an art form. The goal was to make you fear your centurion more than you feared any enemy warrior. Falling asleep on watch wasn't met with a warning. It could earn you the fustuarium, a horrifying ritual where you were beaten to death by your own comrades. Minor infractions were met with floggings, summary punishments, or the assignment of yet more soul-crushing labor. This wasn't about building character. It was about systematically breaking a man down and rebuilding him as an obedient part of the machine, ensuring that the sheer terror of his officers outweighed the misery of his daily existence. After 25 long years of this grim reality, if you managed to survive the elements, the boredom, the disease, and the enemy, you were finally granted retirement, your reward, a plot of land. And where was this land? Often, it was right there on the very frontier you had just spent your entire adult life defending. You had the distinct pleasure of living out your final years as a civilian, staring at the same miserable landscape you stared at as a soldier, forever tied to the site of your suffering. It was Rome's final, cruel joke. You didn't just serve on the frontier, you became the frontier. The glorious tales of Rome are a comfortable lie. The grim, arduous truth is buried beneath forts and lost to time. If you're tired of the propaganda and ready to face the cold, hard facts of the past, then your enlistment papers are ready. Report for duty by hitting that subscribe button and join our legion. We're digging up the dark history that others leave buried, and we promise, the truth is always worth the fight. Before a man became a legionary, a faceless cog in Rome's grand machine, he was just a man, and that man was usually desperate. Let's dispel the romantic notion of legions filled with patriots eager to serve the Senate and people of Rome. For every nobleman's son seeking glory, there were 1,000 dirt-poor farmhands, city-dwellers with no prospects, or sons of families with too many mouths to feed and not enough land to go around. The army wasn't a noble calling for most. It was a job application born of utter destitution. It was the best of a truly awful set of options, a choice made when the alternatives were starvation, debt slavery, or a short career in petty crime ending at the end of a rope. Imagine you are a young man named Gaius in the 1st century. Your family's farm, once viable, has been swallowed by a massive estate owned by a senator you'll never meet. You could stay and work as a hired hand for pennies, or drift to the city of Rome itself to live in a perilously flammable multi-story slum, fighting for scraps of work each day. The world offered you nothing. Then, a recruiting officer marches into your village, his armor polished and his promises gleaming even brighter. He speaks of honor, of steady pay, of a brotherhood of arms, and a secure retirement. He offers you a way out. He offers you a purpose. What he doesn't tell you is the price. The sales pitch was a work of art, carefully crafted to appeal to the hopeless. It promised 3 square meals a day, which already sounded like a feast to a man used to gnawing on stale bread. It promised a regular salary, a concept as foreign as a quiet night's sleep, and it dangled the ultimate prize, a pension upon completing your service, usually a plot of land you could call your own. For a landless man, this was the dream, a chance to regain the one thing that truly meant stability and status in the Roman world. The recruiter painted a picture of a secure and respectable career, conveniently leaving out the parts about dysentery, infected wounds, and the high probability of ending up as barbarian fertilizer in some god-forsaken forest. For those who weren't Roman citizens, the deal was even more devilish, and in some ways more alluring. Joining the auxilia, the non-citizen corps that supported the legions, offered a path to the most coveted prize of all, Roman citizenship. The catch? You had to survive 25 years of service first, 25 years of being treated as second-class soldiers, often placed in the most dangerous positions on the battlefield, all for a document that granted you and your children the rights you should have had all along. It was the longest, most arduous citizenship test in human history, with a final exam that could be administered at any moment by a well-aimed spear. Of course, not everyone who joined the army walked in voluntarily with stars in their eyes. When manpower was low or a particularly nasty war was brewing in an unpopular locale, the state would resort to the delectus or forced conscription. In these cases, a provincial governor would be given a quota, and recruiting officers would sweep through towns and villages, picking out able-bodied men whether they liked it or not. Suddenly, your lack of prospects wasn't your problem anymore. It was the state's. You were now army property. Protests were met with force, and attempts to flee were considered desertion, a crime often punishable by death. The volunteer army had a funny way of making sure it always had enough volunteers. There was also the subtle, yet powerful, pressure of Roman society itself. The concept of virtus, a blend of valor, manliness, and courage, was central to the Roman identity. Serving in the military was seen as the ultimate expression of this virtue. To shy away from service could be seen as cowardly, a stain on your family's honor. This cultural programming was a powerful tool for the state. It convinced young men that marching off to a miserable death on a distant frontier was not only their duty but the noblest possible path they could take. They weren't just escaping poverty, they were becoming real men in the eyes of Rome. So you've made your choice, or rather, your lack of choices has made it for you. You present yourself to the recruiting officer, a man whose smile seems a little too wide, a little too predatory. This is the first step on a very, very long road. The reality of the situation begins to dawn on you as you stand in line with other hopefuls, a collection of the desperate, the dispossessed, and the deluded. The polished promises of the recruiter begin to tarnish as you are herded and inspected like cattle, the first of countless humiliations to come. You are about to sign away your life, your freedom, and your very name for the next quarter of a century. The first hurdle is the probatio, the physical examination. This wasn't a gentle affair with a kindly doctor. A grizzled veteran or officer would look you over, checking for the basic requirements. You had to be the minimum height, at least 5 Roman feet and 7 inches, so you could see over your shield without standing on your tiptoes. They would inspect your eyes, your hearing, and your teeth, not for a winning smile, but to ensure you could chew the notoriously hard military bread. Any sign of physical weakness, chronic illness, or disability, and you were unceremoniously dismissed. The army wanted bodies capable of enduring immense hardship, not nurturing. If you were from a respectable family, even a poor one, a letter of recommendation could go a long way. A note from a local magistrate or a former officer could vouch for your character, suggesting you were less likely to run away at the first sign of trouble. This piece of parchment could be the difference between acceptance and rejection. It was a reminder that even in this supposed meritocracy of strength, who you knew could be just as important as how much you could carry. For those without connections, their own physique and a convincing display of desperation had to suffice. Assuming you passed the physical inspection and your character was deemed acceptable, the next step was the most binding. You were made to swear the sacramentum, the sacred military oath. This was no mere formality. Standing before the standards of the legion, you would repeat the words that legally and spiritually severed you from your old life. You swore to obey the commands of your officers without question, to follow them wherever they might lead, and to never You pledged your life to the emperor, effectively making him your new god. You were no longer your own man. You were a servant of the state, and your body and soul now belonged to Rome. Upon taking the oath, you were given the viaticum, a signing bonus of 3 gold coins. To a man who had never held more than a few copper pieces, this felt like a fortune. It was a moment of elation, a feeling that you had finally made it, that your decision was the right one. This feeling was, of course, deliberately engineered and tragically short-lived. That bonus was immediately docked to pay for your new equipment, your tunic, your boots, your mess kit, and even the nails for your hobnailed sandals. Before you had even marched a single mile, you were already in debt to the very institution you had just joined. The trap had been sprung. With the oath sworn and your bonus already spent, you ceased to be Gaius, or Marcus, or Lucius. You were now a tyro, a raw recruit. Your personal identity was stripped away, replaced by a number and a unit designation. You were given a regulation haircut, and your civilian clothes were taken away, replaced with the rough wool tunic of a soldier. This transformation was psychological. It was designed to break down your sense of self, to erase the individual and forge a component of a larger whole. You were no longer a farmer or a laborer, you were a soldier, and your past was irrelevant. Your new life began with a march. You and the other Tyrones would be led from the recruitment center to your training camp, which could be dozens or even hundreds of miles away. This was your first taste of the legionary's primary occupation, walking. You would learn to march in formation under a heavy pack for mile after agonizing mile, day after day. It was a brutal introduction to the physical demands of military life, a filtering process designed to weed out the truly weak before the army invested any more time or resources in them. Many a recruit's military career ended in failure on this very first march. Arriving at the training camp was another shock to the system. The barracks were long, cramped, and devoid of any privacy. You would sleep in a small 8-man room, the contubernium, sharing your space with strangers from across the empire. The air would be thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and cheap wine. The noise was constant, the discipline absolute. This was your new home, a place of rigid order and zero comfort. Any romantic notions of military life you may have harbored would have evaporated within the first hour of arrival, replaced by the cold, hard reality of your new existence. The training itself was a scientifically designed program of torment. You were issued training equipment, a wicker shield and a wooden sword, both of which were deliberately made to be twice the weight of the real things. The logic was simple and cruel. If you could train for hours with these impossibly heavy items, your actual gear would feel light as a feather in comparison. You would spend endless days practicing strikes against a wooden stake, learning the basic, efficient, and lethal movements of a Roman soldier. It was repetitive, exhausting, and utterly devoid of glamour. Your daily routine was a relentless grind. You would be woken before dawn, and your day would be filled with marching, weapon drills, and more marching. You learned to move as a single entity, to respond instantly to horn calls and shouted commands. You learned to build a fully fortified camp at the end of every day's march, complete with a ditch, a rampart, and sharpened stakes. This was a non-negotiable part of the Roman military doctrine. Whether on the march in hostile territory or during training in a peaceful province, you dug. Every single night. Your shovel became as much a part of you as your sword. The men who trained you, the centurions and optios, were hardened veterans who had all the warmth and compassion of a block of granite. Their primary tool of instruction was the vine staff, and they were not shy about using it to correct a mistake or encourage a flagging recruit. Beatings were a routine part of life, considered a necessary tool to instill discipline and toughness. You learned to fear the wrath of your superiors far more than any external enemy. The training was designed not just to build muscle, but to break your will, to instill a reflexive, unquestioning obedience. It was during this period that the true weight of your 25-year service term would begin to sink in. A year would pass, filled with more hardship than you had ever known in your life, and you would realize with a dawning sense of horror that you had 24 more of these to go. The promise of a pension, once a shining beacon of hope, now seemed impossibly distant, a mythical prize at the end of an endless ocean of suffering. You were trapped, bound by your sacred oath and the unforgiving discipline of the Legion. There was no going back. Congratulations, you've signed up for a quarter century of fun and adventure. Disclaimer: fun and adventure may include frostbite and getting stabbed. The dark humor of your situation might be the only thing that keeps you sane. You would share grim jokes with your fellow recruits, bonding over your shared misery. This gallows humor became a vital coping mechanism, a small act of defiance against the crushing weight of your new reality. You had volunteered, in a sense, but what you had volunteered for was a lifetime of controlled, state-sanctioned suffering. The final stage of your transformation from civilian to soldier was the loss of your right to marry. While in the service of the Legion, you were legally forbidden from taking a wife. This was a practical measure to ensure a soldier's loyalty remained with the army, not with a family. While unofficial relationships with local women were often tolerated, they had no legal standing. Any children from such a union were illegitimate. It was another way the army isolated you, ensuring your only true family was the brotherhood of your concubernarium. You were also taught that your own life was secondary to the preservation of the Legion's standards, particularly the eagle, the aguila. Losing the eagle in battle was the ultimate disgrace, a stain that could only be wiped out by its recovery or the complete annihilation of the Legion. You were drilled to understand that you were expendable, but the symbol of Rome's honor was not. This hammered home the final lesson. You were not an individual, not a hero in the making, but a tool, a shield, a piece of flesh to be expended for the glory of the empire. By the time your training was complete, you were a different man. The soft farmhand or the desperate city dweller was gone, buried under layers of muscle, callous, and psychological conditioning. You were harder, stronger, and emptier. You could march 30 miles with a 60-pound pack, fight effectively with a sword and shield, and build a fortress in a matter of hours. You had been successfully broken down and rebuilt into the perfect Roman legionary. Now, all that was left was to ship you to the worst, most miserable posting on the furthest edge of the known world. Your real service was about to begin. The machine had consumed you. Your hopes, your fears, your very identity had been systematically dismantled and replaced with discipline, obedience, and a grim acceptance of your fate. You were ready to be a legionary on the frontier, not because you were a brave patriot, but because you had been taught that there was no other choice. Your life was now a simple, brutal equation of survival, day by miserable day, for the next 2.5 decades. Welcome to the Roman army. History often presents us with the grand, polished monuments, but it rarely shows us the sweat, blood, and tears of the individuals who built them. The story of the Roman legionary is not just one of conquest, but one of profound personal sacrifice and suffering. If you believe the real stories are found in the gritty details and not just the glorious headlines, then make sure you're in our ranks for the next chapter. Don't miss out on more behind-the-scenes history. Hit that like button and subscribe. The truth is waiting. The transformation from a soft civilian into a Roman legionary was a process fueled by sweat, fear, and an unimaginable amount of walking. The training regimen of the Roman army was not a 4-month boot camp after which you could relax. It was a permanent state of being. It was a lifestyle of perpetual grinding preparation that began the day you took the oath and ended only when you were discharged or died. The core principle was simple. Make training so relentlessly awful that the horrors of actual war would seem like a welcome change of pace. It was a brilliant, if utterly sadistic, piece of psychological engineering. The very first lesson in this new life was the most fundamental: marching. The Roman army didn't just walk, it conquered continents on foot. Recruits were introduced to the military pace, a grueling, non-negotiable rhythm that was to become the soundtrack to their existence. They were expected to cover 20 Roman miles in 5 hours during the summer, a pace that is less a walk and more a punishing, sustained trot. And this was just the standard. The full pace pushed them to cover 24 miles in the same amount of time. This was the metronome of the empire, and you either kept up or you were broken by it. Of course, you weren't just going for a light jog. Every legionary on the march was his own pack animal, laden with a burden that would make a modern-day hiker weep. This pack, the Sarcina, contained everything a soldier needed to live and fight. It included his personal gear, several days' worth of rations, usually around 15 pounds of wheat, a cooking pot, a shovel, a wicker basket for moving earth, a saw, and a pickaxe known as a dolabra. As if that wasn't enough, each man also carried 2 heavy wooden stakes for the camp's defensive palisade. All told, the entire kit could weigh anywhere from 60 to over 100 pounds. Imagine hoisting that weight onto your shoulders at dawn and then setting off at a near jog for 5 relentless hours. This wasn't a scenic hike through the Italian countryside. This was a brutal, full-body workout designed to build inhuman stamina and weed out anyone who couldn't handle it. There were no water breaks every hour or motivational speeches. There was only the rhythmic tramp of thousands of hobnailed sandals on the road and the ever-present threat of the centurion's vine staff for anyone who fell behind. This daily ordeal was the true crucible of the Roman legionary. This relentless marching served a dual purpose. On a practical level, it gave Roman commanders incredible strategic mobility, allowing them to move entire legions vast distances with shocking speed. But on a psychological level, it was a tool of indoctrination. It fostered a deep-seated discipline and a sense of shared suffering that bonded the men together. It stripped away their individuality, turning them into a single, unified entity, a river of men that flowed inexorably toward its destination. It was the foundation upon which every other aspect of their training was built. Once the recruits had proven they could survive the march, they were introduced to the tools of their trade, but this being the Roman army, they didn't get to start with the real thing. Their training sword, the rudicis, and their wicker practice shield were both constructed to be double the weight of their standard-issue counterparts. The logic was, once again, simple and cruel. If you could train for hours on end, swinging a heavy wooden club and maneuvering an unwieldy, oversized shield, the actual gladius and scutum would feel as light as a feather when the time came for real combat. The centerpiece of weapons training was the quintain, a thick wooden stake driven into the ground that stood about 6 feet tall. This inanimate object became the recruit's greatest foe and most important teacher. For hours upon hours, recruits would attack this post. They were taught not to slash wildly, but to deliver efficient, powerful thrusts, aiming for the throat or gut of their wooden opponent. They would practice advancing and retreating, always keeping their shield up, their body protected, learning the deadly and repetitive ballet of Roman infantry combat. This was not the flashy sword fighting you see in movies. It was a science of killing, stripped of all unnecessary movement. Every action was designed for maximum efficiency in the tight press of a battle line. You learned to stab, to punch with the boss of your shield, to work in concert with the men to your left and right. Individuality was a liability. Flair was a death sentence. You were being turned into a small, interchangeable part of a large, cohesive killing machine. The drill was endless, monotonous, and hammered into your muscle memory until you could do it in your sleep. Alongside the sword, recruits drilled endlessly with the pilum, the heavy Roman javelin. They would hurl these weapons at targets, learning to put their entire body into the throw to generate the momentum needed to punch through an enemy's shield and armor. After throwing, they would have to run to retrieve their pillar, and do it all over again. This built the strength and stamina required not just to throw the weapon, but to do so after marching 20 miles, and while under the extreme stress of an impending enemy charge. All this individual training was ultimately in service of the group. The true strength of the legion was its ability to maintain formation under the most extreme pressure. Recruits spent countless hours learning to march in lockstep, to turn as one, to form shield walls, and to execute complex battlefield maneuvers on command. The most famous of these, the testudo or tortoise formation, required every man to trust his comrades implicitly, creating a nearly impenetrable shell of shield. A single man failing to hold his position could compromise the safety of everyone. This brings us to the great, dark irony of the legionary's existence. After months and years of this brutal, relentless training, after being honed into a perfect instrument of war, what did most legionaries spend their time doing? They weren't fighting glorious battles every day. They weren't constantly clashing with barbarian hordes. The vast majority of their service was spent on the frontier, engaged in an entirely different kind of grind. They trained you to be a killing machine, then mostly made you a very efficient ditch digger. The Roman legionary was as much a combat engineer as he was a soldier. His primary weapon on a day-to-day basis was not his sword, but his shovel and pickaxe. The Roman army understood that logistics and defense were the keys to empire, and so the legionaries built. They built roads that sliced through wilderness, aqueducts that carried water for miles, and bridges that spanned impassable rivers. They were the construction arm of the Roman state, and their labor transformed the face of the provinces they occupied. The most crucial and repetitive of these construction tasks was the building of the fortified camp. At the end of every single day's march, no matter how exhausted the men were, no matter the weather, they would construct a complete, functioning fortress from scratch. This was not an optional activity. It was an inviolable rule of Roman military procedure. The camp was their shield against the night, their protection against surprise attacks, and the symbol of Roman order in a chaotic world. The process was a marvel of efficiency born of endless practice. Surveyors would quickly lay out the dimensions of the camp, then the legionaries would get to work. Half the men would stand guard, fully armed, while the other half began the back-breaking labor. They would dig a deep ditch, the fossa, around the perimeter. The earth from this ditch would be used to create a rampart, the agger, on the inside. Finally, the heavy stakes, the sudes, that each man had carried all day, would be driven into the top of the rampart to create a formidable defensive wall. To put this in perspective, a camp for a single legion could be over 50 acres in size. The ditch would be several feet deep and wide, and the rampart several feet high. This was a monumental earth-moving project, undertaken by several thousand men and completed in just a few hours. It was a testament to their training, their discipline, and their sheer physical endurance. It was also, for the men themselves, a daily sentence of hard labor, after an already grueling day of marching. This shared misery was a powerful bonding agent. The 8 men of a cultubernium, the smallest unit in the legion, would dig together, eat together, and sleep together in their leather tent. They relied on each other to get the work done, because any slacking by one man meant more work for the others, or worse, a beating for the entire group from their centurion. These were the men you learned to trust, not because you liked them, but because your survival depended on them. Your tent mates became your only family in this desolate new world. The training regimen also included a variety of other skills designed to create a versatile soldier. Legionaries were expected to be strong swimmers, capable of crossing rivers in full kit. They practiced vaulting onto horses while wearing their armor, a skill crucial for maintaining cohesion with cavalry units. They learned to use slings and throw lead-weighted darts called plumbata. The army's philosophy was to prepare its men for any and every eventuality, ensuring they were never caught completely by surprise. Discipline remained the bedrock of this entire system. The constant threat of punishment was a far more effective motivator than any promise of glory. The centurion's vine staff was the ultimate symbol of his authority, and he used it liberally to enforce his commands. A sloppy drill, a moment of hesitation, or a poorly dug ditch would be met with immediate and painful correction. This culture of casual brutality ensured that every legionary learned to fear his officers more than he feared the enemy. It was a cruel but effective method of control. It is crucial to understand that this training was not a one-time event. Even for veteran legions stationed on a quiet frontier for years, the drills were relentless. A commander would keep his men busy with route marches, weapons practice, and construction projects simply to maintain their edge, and, perhaps more importantly, to prevent the idleness that could lead to dissent and mutiny. On the frontier, boredom was as great an enemy as any barbarian tribe, and the constant grind of training was the army's primary weapon against it. The ultimate goal of this entire system was to bypass thought. In the chaos and terror of a real battle, there is no time for hesitation or consideration. A soldier must react instinctively, his body moving without conscious input. By drilling the same limited set of movements hundreds of thousands of times, the Roman army embedded these actions deep within the legionary's nervous system. When the horns blew and the enemy charged, he wouldn't think. He would simply perform the actions he had been conditioned to perform: step forward, shield up, and thrust. This brutal, repetitive training had a strange psychological effect. It made the prospect of actual battle almost a relief. Combat was a chance to finally put all the endless, monotonous preparation to use. It was a break from the routine of marching and digging. While terrifying, it was at least a different kind of misery. For a few frantic hours, you were the killing machine you had been trained to be, not the beast of burden you were every other day of your life. It was a testament to how awful their daily life was that running at a line of men with sharp objects felt like a holiday. Of course, there was no such thing as a sick day in the Roman army. Feigning illness to get out of training was known as malingering, and it was a crime that was often met with a severe beating or extra duties. The army's medical officers were skilled at spotting fakers. Unless you were genuinely on the verge of death, you were expected to get up and perform your duties. The legion was a machine, and it could not afford to have its parts taking unscheduled breaks. Your personal comfort was not a factor in the imperial equation. Over a 25-year career, this constant, high-impact activity took a devastating toll on the human body. Surviving legionaries who have been examined archaeologically show evidence of extreme wear and tear. Arthritis, stress fractures, chronic back problems, and damaged joints were the common companions of any veteran. The army used up its soldiers, wringing every last ounce of physical effort from their bodies before discharging them. They were tools, and like any tool, they were expected to be worn out through use. In the end, the man who emerged from this crucible was something more and something less than human. He was a professional marcher, a professional digger, a professional killer. He was an expert in the application of organized violence and logistical support. The training stripped him of his individuality and reforged him into a component of something vast and powerful. But the cost was immense, paid in sweat, blood, and the slow erosion of the soul over a quarter-century of grinding, unending labor. The history books are filled with the names of the battles, but they forget the endless marches and the million ditches that made those victories possible. The story of Rome is written in the sweat of these men. If you find value in digging past the marble monuments to uncover the uncomfortable, human truth beneath, then our quest is the same. Support this channel's quest for uncomfortable truths. Like and subscribe. There are many more ditches to dig. After the brutal welcome of recruitment and the soul-crushing grind of training, the Roman legionary was finally sent to his post. This was the moment he would begin his real service, on the very frontier he had been trained to defend. He might have imagined a bustling military city, a hub of Roman power. The reality was invariably a place called a castra, or its smaller cousin, a castellum. It was not a city, it was a box. A wooden or stone box, meticulously designed for defense and efficiency, dropped into the most remote, inhospitable, and strategically inconvenient corner of the known world. This was to be his home for the next 2 decades. The location of these forts was chosen for military advantage, never for comfort. They perched on windswept, rainy hilltops in northern Britannia, where the fog had a physical presence and the sun was a distant legend. They baked in the dusty, arid plains of Syria, where the heat was a physical enemy and water was more precious than gold. Or they stood grimly at the edge of the dense, dark forests of Germania, surrounded by a silence that seemed to hum with unseen threats. The one thing they all had in common was their profound isolation. They were lonely islands of Roman order in a vast, wild sea of nothing. The first and most imposing feature of any fort was its defenses. A deep, V-shaped ditch, a high earthen rampart, and a timber palisade or stone wall. These were formidable barriers, expertly designed to keep out any hostile locals, but after a few weeks of staring at them, a legionary realized they served another purpose. They were also exceptionally good at keeping him in. The walls that protected him also imprisoned him. They were a constant physical reminder of his confinement, a clear line between the rigid, controlled world inside and the vast, alien wilderness outside. The fort was as much a cage as it was a fortress. Inside the walls there was no charming chaos of a normal town. A Roman fort was a masterpiece of soulless, grid-based urban planning. 2 main roads, the Via Principalis and the Via Praetoria, intersected near the center, dividing the camp into 4 neat, depressing quadrants. Every building had its place. The headquarters, the granaries, the workshop, the hospital, and the barracks were all laid out with geometric precision. It was a triumph of order and logic, and a place completely devoid of character, warmth, or any sense of individual identity. It was a machine for living, not a place to live. The absolute heart of the common soldier's existence was the barracks block. These long, narrow buildings were each home to a century of 80 men. The century was then subdivided into 10 contubernia, the 8-man units that were the legionaries' surrogate family. Each contubernia shared a space that was shockingly small, consisting of 2 tiny rooms. The outer room was for storing gear, and the inner room, measuring perhaps 10 by 12 feet, was for sleeping. In this cramped space, 8 grown men lived, slept, and tried to forget where they were. Privacy was a concept as foreign as a hot bath. The interior decorating was minimalist, to put it generously. Each man had a plank of wood, perhaps covered with a straw-stuffed mattress if he was lucky, which served as his bed. He had a peg on the wall for his meager personal belongings. That was it. He shared this intimate space with 7 other men, each with his own unique collection of snores, smells, and night terrors. The air would have been thick and stagnant, a rich tapestry of unwashed bodies, damp wool, leather, and the lingering scent of yesterday's gruel. It was less a home and more a human storage container. Let us take a moment to appreciate the unique aroma of a frontier fort. It was a complex and powerful bouquet that would assault the nostrils the moment you entered. The dominant note was, of course, unwashed humanity. This was blended with the earthy tones of the latrines, the sharp tang of cheap sour wine, the smoky scent of cooking fires, the smell of the leather and grease used to maintain equipment, and, overarching everything, the pervasive odor of dampness and decay. In a timber fort, the smell of slowly rotting wood was a constant companion. It was the smell of empire on the edge of nowhere. Not all quarters were created equal, of course. At the center of the fort stood the Principia, the headquarters building, and next to it, the Praetorium, the personal residence of the fort's commander. Compared to the squalid barracks, these were palaces. The commander had multiple rooms, perhaps even a private bathhouse and mosaic floors. The officers had significantly more space and comfort than the enlisted men. This architectural hierarchy was a constant, visible reminder of a soldier's place in the pecking order. He was at the bottom, and the fort's very layout was designed to make sure he never forgot it. A soldier's day began not with the gentle rays of dawn, but with the jarring blast of a horn. This was the rude metallic scream that sliced through the morning mist, signaling that another identical day of misery had begun. There was no rolling over and hitting the snooze button. You were up, whether it was freezing cold, pouring rain, or blisteringly hot. The first order of business was to assemble for morning roll call, where the duties for the day would be handed out by the centurions. These duties were rarely, if ever, exciting. The day-to-day life of a frontier soldier was defined by routine and menial labor. There were always chores to be done, latrines to be cleaned, fresh water to be hauled, equipment to be repaired and polished, and endless cleaning duties. The fort was in a constant state of entropy, and the legionaries were the unpaid janitorial staff, tasked with holding back the tide of filth and decay. This was not the heroic life a young recruit might have imagined. It was a life of drudgery, punctuated by moments of extreme boredom. The most common duty was guard duty. For hours on end, a soldier would be posted on the ramparts or at a gate, staring out at the unchanging, bleak landscape. He would stand there, in full armor, exposed to the elements, his mind slowly numbed by the sheer monotony of it all. This was a critical job, the fort's first line of defense, but it was also a form of psychological torture. The silence, the wind, the endless gray skies of the north, or the shimmering heat of the east, these were his only companions for long, lonely stretches of time. If you weren't on guard duty, you were likely on a maintenance detail. The earthen ramparts were constantly eroding and needed to be shored up. The timber buildings were always rotting and needed repair. The drains were always clogging and needed to be cleared. The list of thankless tasks was endless. The Roman army was a marvel of logistical self-sufficiency, which was a nice way of saying that the soldiers were expected to be their own carpenters, masons, and plumbers. The glamour of being a warrior was often lost in the muck of a blocked sewer. And then there was the drill. The training never ever stopped. To keep the men sharp and to combat the corrosive effects of boredom, commanders would order constant drills. Even in a fort thousands of miles from Rome, the legionaries would be marching in formation round the compound, practicing their weapon skills against the training posts and rehearsing battlefield maneuvers. It was a way to maintain discipline and fill the long, empty hours. The grind of training camp had simply followed them to their new home. The highlight of any day was, of course, mealtime. This was a chance to break the monotony and refuel for the afternoon's activities. The menu, however, was rarely a cause for celebration. The staple was a wheat or barley porridge, a bland, uninspiring gruel that filled the stomach but did little for the soul. This was accompanied by the famously hard military bread and a ration of sour wine, or posca. Meat was a rarity, and when it was available, its quality was often questionable. It was food as fuel, nothing more. Every fort had a latrina, or latrine block. These were often surprisingly sophisticated, with channels of running water to carry away the waste. They were also entirely communal. A long bench of wood or stone would have a series of holes cut into it, where soldiers would sit side by side, conducting their business in full view of their comrades. While this may have fostered a certain kind of camaraderie, it was also a paradise for germs and disease. The latrine was the social hub that nobody wanted, but everyone had to visit. If you fell ill or were wounded, you were sent to the valetudinarium, the camp hospital. This was a place of last resort. While Roman military medicine was the best in the ancient world, that isn't saying much. The surgeons were skilled at patching wounds and setting bones, but their understanding of infection and disease was non-existent. The hospital was a clean, orderly building, but it was also a place where a minor infection could easily turn deadly. Most soldiers rightly viewed a trip to the hospital with a deep sense of dread. And when the day's duties were finally over, what was there to do for entertainment? This is where the grim reality of isolation truly hit home. There were no theaters, no amphitheaters, no grand public baths. Your local pub was a tent, and the entertainment was watching the grass grow, if there was any grass. The crushing boredom of the frontier evening was an enemy as formidable as any barbarian tribe. The men were left to their own devices, in a place with very few devices to be left to. The primary form of entertainment was gambling. Soldiers would wager their meager pay on games of dice, despite the fact that it was often officially forbidden. It was a small way to feel a thrill, to break the monotony of the long, dark evenings. Other than that, they had stories and complaints. They would gather in their dark, cramped barracks, share tales of home, and complain endlessly about the food, the weather, the officers, and their miserable lot in life. Complaining was the unofficial sport of the Roman army. Often, a civilian settlement called a vicus would spring up outside the walls of a permanent fort. This was a collection of merchants, artisans, food vendors, and tavern keepers who catered to the needs of the soldiers. The vicus was a taste of the outside world, a place to get a better meal, a stronger drink, or find some companionship. But it was also a source of debt, disease, and trouble. A brief escape from the fort often led to a much longer punishment back inside it. The weather was not just a topic of conversation, it was a malevolent entity. In places like Britannia or Germania, the damp was inescapable. It seeped into the timber of the barracks, into your woolen cloak, into your leather boots, and into your very bones. It made the cold feel colder and made life a constant state of clammy discomfort. In the east, the relentless sun and dust were just as oppressive, cracking the skin and straining the eyes. There was no escaping the tyranny of the local climate. This physical isolation bred a deep psychological isolation. You were cut off from everything you had ever known. Letters from your family, if they came at all, were months old, describing a world that no longer felt real. You were surrounded by the same few hundred faces every single day. The sameness of the place, the routine, and the people could wear a man down, sanding away his spirit until all that was left was a grim, resigned husk. You were a ghost, haunting the edge of the world. The strict military hierarchy was a constant presence. You were always aware of your rank and the ranks of those around you. An ordinary legionary was expected to show absolute deference to his centurion, who in turn answered to the tribunes who answered to the fort's commander. This rigid structure governed every interaction, creating a tense, formal atmosphere where a wrong word or a disrespectful glance could result in a swift and painful punishment. It was a society built on fear and obedience. And so the days would blur into one another, each one a near-perfect copy of the last. The sun would rise, the horn would blow, and the routine would begin again. You would march, you would dig, you would stand guard, you would eat your gruel, and you would sleep. And you would do it again, and again, and again. The 25-year service term, once an abstract number, became a crushing weight, a mountain of identical days stretching out before you, each one to be endured before you could earn your freedom. This was the true meaning of service on the frontier. This fort, this cold, damp, orderly, and miserable box became your world. It was a place designed not for living, but for enduring. It was a symbol of Roman power, but for the men inside it was a symbol of their own powerlessness. They were there to protect the empire, but in the process their own lives were consumed by the very walls meant to protect them. They were far from home, and perilously close to absolutely nothing. The stories of grand legions and glorious campaigns are fascinating, but the quiet, daily misery of the men in the forts is a history that's often overlooked. It's the story of endurance against the odds, not just in battle, but against boredom, isolation, and despair. If you're finding this fascinating, you absolutely must like and subscribe. Join us as we continue to uncover the uncomfortable, unspoken truths that lie buried on the frontiers of history. The Roman fort, for all its misery and confinement, represented a sliver of safety in a hostile world. But a soldier could not spend his entire career cowering behind its walls. The true core function of a legionary stationed at the edge of the world was the patrol. It was his job to walk the lines, the very line that separated the order of the Roman Empire from the supposed chaos beyond. This was the daily, grinding reality of frontier service. It was a duty defined by endless, monotonous walking, punctuated by moments of the most extreme and brutal terror imaginable. The day would begin like any other, with the horn blast and the morning roll call. Then the centurion would read out the assignments. If your sentry was tasked with patrol duty, a collective internal groan would ripple through the ranks. It meant leaving the relative security of the fort and venturing out into the great dangerous unknown. It meant a long day of walking, of vigilance, of being exposed to the elements and to an enemy who knew the land far better than you ever would. It was the part of the job everyone dreaded, yet it was the job itself. The ritual of gearing up was a familiar, somber dance. You would methodically don the layers of your military life, the tunic, the mail shirt or segmented armor, the heavy helmet, and the greaves to protect your shins. You would check the edge on your gladius, ensure your shield straps were secure, and pick up your piler, the heavy javelins that were your first and best line of defense. The full weight of the gear was a familiar burden, a constant reminder of your profession and the dangers it entailed. It was the uniform of a man walking into potential oblivion. For a standard day patrol, you might be spared the crushing weight of the full marching pack. Your pickaxe, shovel, and camping stakes could be left behind. This was the army's version of traveling light, but you would still carry your weapons, a water skin and several pounds of rations, usually the same hard bread and dried meat you ate every other day. This lighter load was still a significant burden, and you would feel every ounce of it by the time the day was done. It was just enough to keep you alive, and just heavy enough to make you miserable. Before you left, there would be a perfunctory briefing from the centurion. He would point to a map etched in wax or drawn in the dirt, outlining a patrol route you had probably walked 100 times before. He would tell you to check in at certain watchtowers, to keep your eyes open and to report anything unusual. It was all standard procedure, advice so obvious it was almost insulting. The real message was unspoken. Do not get ambushed, do not lose any men, and do not disgrace the legion. No pressure. Stepping through the main gate of the fort was like plunging into cold water. Inside the walls there was a sense of order, of safety in numbers. The moment you were outside, that illusion shattered. The world became bigger, emptier, and infinitely more threatening. Your senses would go on high alert. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every bird call, every distant shadow was a potential threat. You were now in the enemy's world. The patrol had begun, and with it, the long, slow tightening of tension in your gut. You would not march in a relaxed column. A patrol moved as a tight, disciplined unit, always ready for combat. You walked in a formation that could be turned into a defensive square or a shield wall in a matter of seconds. The pace was cautious and deliberate. This was not the brisk, road-eating march of a legion on the move. This was the wary tread of men who knew they were being watched, men who expected violence to erupt from the landscape at any moment. Every step was a calculated risk. The scenery on these patrols was rarely inspiring. Your daily steps count was impressive, but your scenery was mostly trees or more trees or snowy trees, or perhaps bog, more bog, and rocks that looked like they could hide a dozen angry tribesmen. The landscape was a monotonous backdrop to your own internal anxieties. In Germania, it was the endless gloomy forest. In Britannia, the rolling, misty hills and damp moors. In the east, the shimmering, featureless desert. It was a beauty that held no comfort, only a sense of profound and alienating emptiness. The only sounds were those you made yourself, the rhythmic clank and jingle of your equipment, the crunch of your hobnailed sandals on the gravel path, or the squelch of them in the mud. This was overlaid by the sigh of the wind or the cry of a hawk, but even these natural sounds were suspect. A skilled warrior could imitate a bird call to signal his comrades. A sudden silence was often more terrifying than any noise, for it meant that even the animals were holding their breath, aware of a predator you could not see. The frontier, the lines itself, took many forms. On a posting like Hadrian's Wall in Britain, it was a literal, towering stone barrier, a massive statement of Roman power. Your patrol would follow the military road that ran alongside it. In other places, like Germania, the frontier might be a simple line of timber watchtowers, connected by a cleared track. In the desert, it could be a series of fortified oases. Whatever its form, your job was the same, to be the human fence, to project Roman authority into the wilderness through the simple, arduous act of walking. A typical patrol involved moving from one small watchtower or mile castle to the next. These tiny outposts were manned by a handful of your fellow soldiers, men living in even greater isolation than you were. You would exchange a few words, confirm that there was nothing to report, and perhaps share a quick drink of water before moving on. These brief encounters were small points of light in a long, dark day, a momentary reassurance that you were not entirely alone out here in the vast emptiness. The hours would crawl by with agonizing slowness. The sun, your only timepiece, would drift across the sky, its progress marked by the shifting of the shadows. The boredom was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that settled over your shoulders. Your mind would go numb from the lack of stimulation. You would focus on the simple mechanics of walking, on the rhythm of your breathing, on the familiar weight of your shield on your arm. This was the reality of being a soldier on the frontier. It was not a life of adventure, it was a life of professional, monotonous ambulation. Countless times a day, the boredom would be shattered by a jolt of pure adrenaline. A deer would break from cover with a crash that sounded exactly like an ambush. A trick of the light would make a bush look exactly like a crouching warrior. Your heart would leap into your throat, your hand would tighten on your sword, and your body would tense for a fight. And then, a moment later, you would realize it was nothing. The wave of adrenaline would recede, leaving you shaky and drained. This constant cycle of false alarms was exhausting. The weather was your most constant and implacable foe. It showed no mercy. On a northern frontier, the rain was a persistent misery, soaking you to the bone and turning the ground into a treacherous, muddy quagmire. In winter, the biting wind and blinding snow were even worse, sapping your strength and hiding the dangers that lay in wait. On an eastern post, the relentless sun would beat down on your helmet, cooking your brain and cracking your lips, while the dust got into your eyes, your throat, and your soul. There was never any escape. To survive the mental grind, every soldier developed his own coping mechanisms. Some would sing marching songs quietly to themselves, the rhythm matching their steps. Others would let their minds drift to thoughts of home, of a warm meal or a familiar face, a dangerous but comforting form of escapism. Many would simply try to empty their minds altogether, entering a meditative state of pure, thoughtless walking. Anything was better than focusing on the sheer mind-numbing tedium of the present moment. The physical toll of these endless patrols was immense. A standard patrol could easily cover 15 miles in a day, up and down hills, through bogs and over rough terrain. Multiply that by the number of patrols you would undertake in a year, And then, by the 25 years of your service, your feet, even in their sturdy military sandals, would be a permanent ruin of blisters, calluses, and aching bones. You were in essence slowly walking yourself to death for the glory of Rome. Then, inevitably, would come the day when it was not a false alarm. The change was subtle at first. A sudden, unnatural silence in the forest, a set of footprints where none should be, the faint, distant smell of a wood fire. Every instinct, honed by months or years of this nervous existence, would scream that something was wrong. The air itself would seem to grow thick and heavy. The time for boredom was over. The time for terror had begun. Perhaps you would find a sign, a discarded piece of equipment from another Roman patrol, a single dark stain on the path that could only be blood. Or you might stumble upon the scene of a previous skirmish, the grim tableau of bodies telling a silent, horrific story. These discoveries were ice in the veins. You knew you were not just walking into potential danger, you were following in the footsteps of men who had already found it. The ambush, when it came, was an explosion of chaotic violence. It was never a fair fight. A volley of arrows would hiss out of the trees, thudding into shields and flesh. A cacophony of terrifying war cries would erupt from all around you. Figures would materialize from the landscape as if from nowhere, charging at you with spears and axes. The world would dissolve into a blur of noise, movement, and stark primal fear. In that moment of absolute terror, your years of brutal, repetitive training would take over. You would not have time to think, only to react. You would drop to one knee, lock your shield with the man next to you, and draw your sword. Your patrol, once a line of walking men, would become a bristling defensive island of Roman steel. You were a terrified man, but you were also a professional, and your body would perform the deadly dance it had been taught, even as your mind screamed. The fight itself would be a whirlwind of brutal, intimate violence. It was not the organized clash of legions you saw on triumphal arches. It was a desperate, ugly, close-quarters struggle for survival. You would stab and block, shove with your shield, and hear the grunts of exertion and the screams of pain from friend and foe alike. It would likely be over in a matter of minutes, but those minutes would stretch into an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it began, it would be over. The enemy, having struck their blow, would melt back into the landscape, leaving behind a shocking, ringing silence. The adrenaline would begin to fade, replaced by trembling hands and the sickening smell of blood. You would take stock of the aftermath. Men would be wounded, their groans cutting through the quiet. Some of your comrades might be dead. The victory, if you could even call it that, would taste like ash. The long walk back to the fort was a different kind of hell. The exhaustion was a physical pain, but sleep was an impossible luxury. Every shadow was now a confirmed threat. Every sound was the precursor to another attack. You would move with a desperate urgency, carrying your wounded, your senses screaming at you from every direction. The familiar landscape was now a nightmarish maze, and the fort was a distant, desperately needed sanctuary. Staggering back through the gates was a moment of profound, overwhelming relief. The solid walls and the presence of your fellow soldiers were the most beautiful sight in the world. You had survived. But the relief was always temporary. You knew, with a certainty that chilled you to your core, that in a few days you would have to go out and do it all again. The physical wounds might heal, but the psychological scars of the patrol would remain. This was the unending, soul-crushing cycle of frontier life. It was a life of extremes, a pendulum swinging between 99% mind-numbing boredom and 1% heart-stopping terror. There was no middle ground. There was only the long, empty walk and the brief, bloody fight. This was the reality that slowly but surely ground down even the strongest of men over the course of a 25-year sentence at the edge of the world. The great walls and forts of the Roman frontier were impressive, but the real empire was maintained by the boots of these men walking endless, thankless miles, day after day. Their story is a secret hidden in the mud and mist of forgotten borders. If you want to help us continue to dig up these uncomfortable but vital truths, then there's a vital role for you to play. Help us unravel more historical secrets. Like and subscribe. Of all the enemies a Roman legionary faced on the frontier, the most relentless, the most impartial, and the most inescapable was the weather. A barbarian horde could be defeated, a rebellion could be crushed, but the climate was an adversary that attacked every single day without pause for 25 years. It was a form of slow, grinding torture that could break a man just as surely as any sword or spear. For a soldier of the Empire, the daily weather report was not small talk. It was a matter of life and death. Most recruits who joined the legions were born and raised under the mild, predictable skies of the Mediterranean. They were accustomed to warm, dry summers and cool, rainy winters. They understood the sun and the seasons in a way that was fundamentally Italian. This comfortable understanding was brutally shattered the moment they arrived at their first frontier posting. Whether they were sent north to the perpetual dampness of Britannia or east to the searing deserts of Syria, they were plunged into a hostile environment that their bodies and minds were utterly unprepared for. The standard-issue Roman kit was a marvel of military engineering for a Mediterranean campaign, but it was woefully inadequate for the climatic extremes of a global empire. The soldier's uniform was essentially the same everywhere: a simple wool tunic, an open-toed sandal called a caliga, and a heavy woolen cloak, the pianula, for bad weather. This one-size-fits-all approach to climate control meant that in practice it fit almost nowhere perfect. The army provided the man and the armor. Surviving the local climate was largely his own problem to solve. Imagine a young legionary from sunny Campania arriving in Germania just as his first winter descends. He would have never experienced a cold that was a physical entity, a predator that stalked the air and stole the breath from his lungs. The first snowfall, perhaps a novelty for an hour, quickly becomes a persistent white blanket that smothers the landscape, hiding familiar paths and making every step a chore. The sight of a river freezing solid would be a terrifying spectacle, a sign that the world he knew had been replaced by a new, hostile reality ruled by ice. But it wasn't just the cold. It was the wet. The northern frontiers of Britannia and Germania were defined by a bone-chilling, soul-sapping dampness. Rain was a constant companion for much of the year, and even when it wasn't raining, the air was heavy with mist and fog. This moisture seeped into everything. It permeated his woolen cloak, his leather gear, and his straw bedding, ensuring he was never truly dry. It was a dampness that got into his bones, leaving him with a permanent chill and a constant ache in his joints. The barracks offered little refuge from the relentless cold. These were drafty timber structures, built for function, not comfort. A small open hearth in the center of the room provided the only source of heat. This fire was a mixed blessing, offering a tiny bubble of warmth while filling the cramped space with choking, eye-watering smoke. At night, 8 men would huddle together in their small room, their breath misting in the air, listening to the wind howl outside as it found every crack and gap in the walls. Sleep was less about rest and more about not freezing to death before morning. To combat this, soldiers had to adapt, often by adopting the very barbarian fashions they were supposed to despise. They would wear multiple tunics, and crucially, they would acquire trousers or bracae, the ultimate symbol of a non-Roman, to protect their legs from the biting wind. They learned to stuff their open-oped sandals with scraps of wool and fur for insulation, and the widespread adoption of wool socks or udones became a vital, if unofficial, part of the winter uniform. These were not fashion choices, they were acts of desperate self-preservation. Standing guard duty on the ramparts during a northern winter was a special kind of hell. For hours a soldier would stand exposed on the wall, leaning into a wind that felt like it was made of razors. The snow would pile up around his feet and cling to his cloak, slowly turning him into a miserable, shivering statue. His primary battle was not against any external enemy, but against the insidious creep of hypothermia and the overwhelming urge to simply fall asleep in the snow. Many who succumbed to that urge were never woken up. Patrolling in the winter was even worse. The familiar landscape was transformed into a treacherous white maze. The snow could hide holes, roots, and patches of ice, making every step a potential disaster. A simple fall could result in a broken bone, a death sentence in this environment. Frostbite was a constant threat, turning fingers, toes, and noses numb and black. And the silent, snow-draped forests were the perfect setting for an ambush, allowing an enemy to approach unheard and unseen until it was far too late. The cold also turned a soldier's own equipment against him. His metal armor, a lifesaver in combat, became a conductor of cold, chilling him to the core. Touching a piece of exposed metal with a bare hand in freezing temperatures could instantly strip the skin away. His helmet, designed to deflect swords, felt like a bucket of ice on his head. Even his sword hilt would be painfully cold to the touch. His own gear, the very symbol of his power, became another source of constant, nagging misery. The winter campaign was fought on a second front, the desperate, endless search for fuel. An immense amount of firewood was needed simply to keep the barracks from freezing and to cook the soldiers' meals. Foraging parties would have to venture out into the dangerous, snow-covered forests, constantly vulnerable to attack. Food rations also had to be increased as men burned far more calories just trying to stay warm. Winter turned the simple act of survival into a full-time, labor-intensive occupation for the entire garrison. Beyond the physical hardship was the psychological toll. The northern winter was a season of darkness. The days were short, the nights achingly long. The sky was often a featureless, oppressive ceiling of grey cloud that hung over the world for months on end. This lack of sunlight, combined with the cold and isolation, could lead to a profound sense of depression and hopelessness. The world felt dead, and it was easy for a soldier's spirit to begin to die along with it. When spring finally arrived, it brought not relief, but a different kind of misery. The great thaw turned the entire landscape into a sea of mud. The ground, frozen solid for months, would dissolve into a thick, sticky, boot-sucking mire. The roads became impassable rivers of sludge. The area around the fort became a fetid swamp. Moving anywhere required a monumental effort. After months of praying for the snow to end, the legionary now found himself praying for the mud to dry. One minute you're praying for shade, the next you're praying for your toes not to fall off. Such was the schizophrenic nature of service in the Roman Empire. A soldier transferred from the German frontier to a posting in Judea or North Africa would trade one form of environmental torture for its complete and total opposite. He would leave the world of ice and dampness for a new hell made of fire and sand. The enemy was no longer the cold, but the sun. On the eastern and southern frontiers, the sun was not a gentle, life-giving force. It was a malevolent, white-hot tyrant that ruled the sky from dawn till dusk. There was no escaping its glare or its heat. The landscape was often a barren expanse of rock and sand that acted like a giant oven, reflecting the sun's rays and creating a blistering convection oven effect. For a man from a temperate climate, the sheer oppressive power of this heat was a profound shock. A soldier's armor, his primary defense in battle, became his worst enemy in the desert. The metal plates of the lorica segmentata, or the rings of the lorica hamata, would absorb the sun's heat, turning his torso into a personal furnace. The helmet would become searingly hot, cooking his head. He was, in effect, being slowly baked alive inside his own protective gear. The only thing worse than wearing it was taking it off and exposing his skin to the brutal, unfiltered rays of the sun. Thirst was a constant, gnawing presence. The army's ration of water, or more commonly posca, was strictly controlled and rarely felt like enough. The sourness of the vinegar-water mixture did little to quench the desperate craving for pure, cool water. A soldier's life revolved around the next water source, the next well, the next oasis. Dehydration was a constant threat, turning a man's tongue to sandpaper and his mind to mush. Marching under the desert sun was a race against the evaporation of your own body. Heat stroke was the ever-present danger that haunted every patrol and every training drill. The combination of extreme heat, heavy armor, and physical exertion was a deadly one. The first signs were a throbbing headache and dizziness, followed by confusion and delirium. Legionaries collapsing on the march were a common and grim occurrence. Without immediate cooling and hydration, a man could die within hours. The sun was a silent and efficient killer. The iconic Roman military sandal, the caliga, was perfectly designed for marching on paved roads. It was, however, tragically ill-suited for the desert. The open-air design offered no protection from the scorching hot sand which would bake the soles of a soldier's feet, causing painful blisters. The straps would chafe against sweat-soaked, dust-covered skin, rubbing it raw. Every step was an exercise in pain management, a fiery reminder that you were a long, long way from home. And then there was the dust. In the arid landscapes of the East, a fine, choking dust was a permanent feature of the air. It was stirred up by the wind, by marching feet, by everything that moved. It got into a soldier's eyes, making them red and raw. It got into his mouth and throat, creating a perpetual, gritty thirst. It coated his food, adding a layer of sand to every miserable meal. It worked its way into his lungs, leading to chronic, hacking coughs. It was an inescapable, abrasive irritant. The glare of the sun, reflecting off the pale sand and rock, was blinding. There were no sunglasses to offer protection. A soldier spent his days squinting against a light so harsh it felt like a physical blow. This constant eye strain led to debilitating headaches and, over time, could cause permanent damage to his vision. The world was a painful, overexposed photograph that offered no shade and no relief for the eyes. The local wildlife was also less than welcoming. The heat brought out a delightful variety of venomous companions. Scorpions would seek shade in boots and bedrolls, delivering a nasty surprise to an unwary soldier. Vipers would bask on sun-warmed rocks, their camouflage making them nearly invisible until it was too late. And the swarms of flies and other biting insects saw a large, slow-moving, sweating legionary as a walking feast. Nature, it seemed, was actively trying to kill, or at least severely irritate him. Even the nights offered little respite. While the temperature would drop, the ground itself would continue to radiate the heat it had absorbed all day. The barracks would be stiflingly hot and airless, turning any attempt at sleep into a sweaty, uncomfortable ordeal. You would lie there drenched in your own sweat, listening to the buzz of insects, praying for a breeze that would never come, knowing that the whole agonizing cycle would begin again in just a few short hours when the sun rose. Ultimately, whether a legionary was shivering in a blizzard in Britannia or baking on a salt flat in Syria, the story was the same. The climate was a relentless, impartial torturer. It was a battle he fought every minute of every day, a war of attrition against his own body and his own sanity. He could not defeat it, he could not sign a treaty with it, and he could not escape it. He could only endure it. This daily, grinding battle against the elements was the true, unspoken misery of life on the Roman frontier. The grand narrative of Rome is one of legions marching and conquering, but so much of that marching was a struggle against the very ground they walked on and the air they breathed. The dull, dark history is in the details, the frostbitten toes and the sun-cracked lips. If you appreciate these less than glorious truths, you're in the right place. Don't miss out on more dark and dull history. Like and subscribe. The Roman propaganda machine was exceptionally good at creating monsters. On the triumphal arches and columns back in Rome, the barbarian was always depicted in one of two ways, either as a wild-haled bearded giant, cowering in terror and begging for Roman mercy, or as a wild-haled bearded giant, charging with mindless, suicidal fury into a neat line of Roman shields. For the citizens back home, this was a comforting and simple image. It was us versus them, civilization versus chaos. It was also, for the poor legionary stationed on the frontier, a dangerous oversimplification. The reality was that the term barbarian was a lazy, catch-all phrase that simply meant not Roman. It was a bucket into which the Romans threw hundreds of distinct and diverse cultures: the painted Picts of Caledonia, the forest-dwelling Germanic tribes, the nomadic horse archers of the Scythian plains, and the sophisticated silk-wearing nobles of the Parthian Empire were all just barbarians to the average soldier. His job wasn't to understand them, but to keep them on their side of the line. This fundamental ignorance was a source of constant and often fatal surprises. The core of the problem was a massive cultural clash over the very concept of warfare. The Romans valued order, discipline, and the decisive, pitched battle. They liked to line up, have the enemy line up, and then resolve the matter in a professional if bloody manner. Most of the tribes they faced considered this strategy to be laughably stupid. Why would you stand in an open field and allow the world's most efficient killing machine to methodically take you apart? It made much more sense to use the landscape, to strike from the shadows, to raid and retreat, and to fight a war of 1,000 cuts. This led to a situation that was less like a grand clash of civilizations and more like a terrible neighborly dispute that constantly spiraled out of control. The Roman legionary was a highly trained professional soldier prepared for a major war. Instead, he found himself dealing with problems on a much more mundane and intensely annoying level. They weren't always noble savages, sometimes they were just really loud neighbors who kept stealing your sheep. For every organized invasion, there were 1,000 instances of cattle rustling, petty raids on farmsteads, and general mischief designed to test the defenses and make the Romans' lives miserable. It's also a mistake to think of the frontier as a place of constant, unceasing hostility. The relationship between the Romans and the local tribes was often a complex mix of war, trade, and cautious diplomacy. A tribe might be trading pottery and hides with the garrison one day and then trying to ambush one of its patrols the next. Many tribesmen even joined the Roman army as auxiliaries, fighting for the very empire their relatives were fighting against. For the legionary on the ground, this made life incredibly confusing. The man selling you chickens today might be the man trying to put a spear in you tomorrow. From the legionary's perspective, this unpredictability was a form of psychological torture. He was trained to identify and neutralize a clear threat. But on the frontier, the threat was ambiguous and ever-present. Every local farmer, every trader, every hunter seen near the fort could be a potential spy or a scout for a raiding party. The legionary lived in a state of perpetual low-grade paranoia, viewing all non-Romans with a deep and abiding suspicion. This constant anxiety was as wearing as any physical hardship. In the dense, dark forests of Germania, the legionary faced tribes like the Cherusci, the Chatti, and the Marcomanni. These were not disorganized savages. They were fierce warriors who were masters of their environment. Their primary tactic was the ambush. They would use their intimate knowledge of the forest to draw a Roman patrol into a narrow valley or a dense thicket, and then erupt from the trees in a terrifying wave of violence. The initial charge, accompanied by deafening war cries, was designed to create shock and panic, breaking the Romans' disciplined formation before it could be properly established. For a Roman soldier trained to fight in open formations, the forest was a green hell. His large shield became tangled in the undergrowth. His rigid formation was impossible to maintain. Visibility was limited to a few feet, and the enemy could be anywhere. The Germanic tribesmen, lightly armed and clad in leather or furs, moved through the trees like ghosts, striking quickly and melting away before a counterattack could be organized. The infamous Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, where 3 entire legions were annihilated, was a permanent and terrifying reminder of what could happen when the Roman war machine left the road and entered the trees. Further north, in the misty highlands of Caledonia, the Romans faced the Picts. The name, given by the Romans, likely meant the Painted Ones, a reference to their practice of decorating their bodies with tattoos or war paint. The Picts were the masters of the hit-and-run raid. They refused to engage in pitched battles, preferring to use their knowledge of the rugged terrain to their advantage. A small Pictish war party could emerge from the fog, overwhelm a small outpost or patrol, and then vanish back into the hills, leaving behind only death and confusion. The Picts were experts in psychological warfare. They were a constant, unseen threat that preyed on the minds of the soldiers stationed on Hadrian's Wall or the Antonine Wall. The Romans built massive fortifications to contain them, but these walls were porous. The Picts could always find a way over or around them. They were a persistent, irritating, and deadly reminder that Roman control was limited. They couldn't be conquered because they couldn't be pinned down. They were a terror born of the landscape itself, a foe as persistent and unsettling as the endless northern mist. In the east, the legionary faced an entirely different kind of enemy. The Parthian and later the Sasanian empires were sophisticated, wealthy, and highly organized states. Calling them barbarians was pure Roman arrogance. They possessed large, well-equipped armies, including heavily armored cavalrymen, known as cataphracts, who could challenge even the best Roman infantry. Fighting in the East was not a police action, it was a war between superpowers. The signature weapon of the Eastern armies was the horse archer. The Parthians, in particular, perfected a tactic that drove Roman commanders to madness: the Parthian shot. Their light cavalry would charge towards the Roman lines, firing a volley of arrows. Just as the Romans braced for impact, the horsemen would feign a retreat. As they galloped away, the riders would twist around in their saddles and fire another, often more deadly, volley of arrows into the now exposed Roman rank. It was a tactic that required incredible skill and completely nullified the Romans' traditional strengths. On the vast open steppes bordering the Black Sea, the legions encountered nomadic peoples like the Sarmatians and the Roxolani. These were entire cultures that lived on horseback. Their mobility was a strategic nightmare for the infantry-based Roman army. They could strike anywhere along a vast frontier and then disappear before the slow-moving legions could respond. They had no cities to capture and no farms to burn. Trying to fight them was like trying to punch the wind. Even in areas that had been long conquered, the threat of rebellion was ever present. The Dacians from the region of modern-day Romania were a fierce and resilient people who fought two major wars against the Emperor Trajan. They were skilled miners who built a network of formidable fortresses in the Carpathian Mountains, forcing the Romans into a long and costly campaign of mountain warfare. The Romans won, but the Dacian Wars were a bloody reminder that even barbarians could be an immense threat. Earlier in Roman history, the legions had faced the Gauls, a collection of Celtic tribes that were passionate, brave, and famously disunited. Julius Caesar's great success in Gaul was not just military but political. He expertly exploited the rivalries between the different Gallic tribes, preventing them from forming a united front against him until it was too late. While individually fierce, their inability to cooperate was their ultimate undoing, a lesson that demonstrated the importance of the Romans' own unity and discipline. What all these vastly different peoples had in common from the Roman soldiers' point of view was that they were frustratingly unpredictable. They did not follow the established rules of warfare. They valued speed, surprise, and cunning over disciplined formations and set-piece battles. For a legionary whose entire training was based on order, predictability, and teamwork, this was deeply unsettling. He was a creature of the line and the square, forced to fight an enemy who thought in terms of the raid and the circle. It cannot be stressed enough that the life of a frontier soldier was not one of glorious back-to-back battles. The reality was a constant, low-level grind. It was the death of 1,000 cuts model of warfare. A typical week might involve no combat at all, just a series of minor provocations. A section of the frontier fence might be torn down. A few head of cattle might be stolen from a nearby farm. A sentry might have a rock thrown at him from the darkness. These were small things, but they added up, creating a constant state of tension and annoyance. The classic barbarian tactic was the raid. A small war party, sometimes no more than a dozen men, would cross the frontier under the cover of darkness. They would move quickly and silently towards a soft target, a supply wagon, an isolated watchtower, or a civilian farmstead in the Vicus. They would strike with sudden, overwhelming force, grabbing whatever loot, food, or captives they could, and then they would be gone, melting back into the wilderness before the garrison could even sound the alarm. For the legionaries, this was infuriating. They were the sledgehammer of the ancient world, an army designed to crush other armies, yet they were being constantly pestered by these hit-and-run tactics. By the time a patrol was dispatched to the scene of a raid, the attackers were long gone. The soldiers were left to count their dead, repair the damage, and stare angrily into the empty landscape, feeling utterly powerless. It was a deeply unsatisfying and demoralizing way to fight a war. This cycle of violence often fed itself. After a successful raid, the Romans would feel compelled to respond. They would launch a punitive expedition across the frontier, marching into tribal territory. Since they could rarely catch the warriors responsible, they would resort to collective punishment, burning villages and crops. This in turn would create immense resentment among the tribes, driving more young men to become warriors and leading to even more raids in the future. It was a brutal, self-perpetuating cycle of violence with no clear end in sight. A legionary's greatest fear was the unknown. Was the local tribe planning a major assault, or were they just angry that a Roman patrol had trampled their sacred grove? Was the lone hunter on the horizon truly hunting deer, or was he counting the number of men on the wall? The Romans tried to maintain a network of spies and informants, but these locals were often unreliable, telling the Romans whatever they thought they wanted to hear. Every decision had to be made with incomplete and often contradictory information. We must also remember the human cost for the non-combatants, the families of soldiers and the local merchants who lived in the settlements just outside the forts were the softest targets of all. They lived in a permanent state of anxiety, knowing that they were the most likely victims of any raid. Their lives were completely dependent on the legion's ability to protect them, an ability that was frequently called into question by the ghosts who struck in the night. It's easy to imagine the soldiers hating the tribesmen they fought, and they certainly did, but mixed in with the fear and contempt there must have been moments of grudging respect. The legionary, shivering in his wool cloak, must have marveled at the barbarian's ability to survive the winter with seemingly little gear. The soldier, sweating in his heavy armor, must have envied the tribesman's speed and knowledge of the terrain. They were a formidable and resilient foe. In the final analysis, the war against the barbarians was unwinnable. The Roman Empire, for all its power, could not conquer every forest, every mountain range, and every desert. The legionary on the frontier was not there to achieve a final victory, he was there to manage a permanent problem. His job was to be a human wall, a living embodiment of Roman defiance, standing watch over a line that was constantly being tested, prodded, and attacked. It was a long, thankless, and brutally frustrating way to spend a life. The history of Rome is often told from the center, from the Senate House and the Forum, but the empire was defined at its edges, in the clashes between the ordered world of the legion and the unpredictable world beyond. The stories of these encounters are messy, complicated, and far from glorious. If you're enjoying this look into the gritty reality of the past, then there's a simple way to join our ranks. Please like and subscribe. They say an army marches on its stomach. For the Roman legionary on the frontier, this was a terrifying prospect, because his stomach was usually filled with a monotonous, gritty, and profoundly uninspiring slurry of cheap carbohydrates. The Roman military's approach to cuisine was the same as its approach to everything else. It was brutally efficient, ruthlessly standardized, and completely devoid of joy. The goal was not to delight the palate, but to provide enough raw fuel to keep the imperial machine marching, digging, and, when necessary, dying. The foundation of this glorious legionary diet rested on three unshakable and deeply unexciting pillars: grain, sour wine, and salt. These were the core components of the daily ration. Everything else, a stringy piece of bacon, a hard chunk of cheese, a wilted onion, was considered a luxury, a bonus feature in the daily grind of survival. The Roman state understood that you didn't need happy soldiers to conquer the world. You just needed soldiers who had enough energy to lift a shield and a shovel. Flavor was a logistical weakness the empire simply could not afford. To add insult to indigestion, this culinary experience wasn't even free. The cost of a soldier's daily rations was deducted directly from his meager salary. At the end of each pay period, after the deductions for food, boots, clothing, and his burial fund, there was often precious little left over. In essence, the legionary was paying for the privilege of eating some of the worst food imaginable. It was a perfect, closed economic loop of misery, where you labored all day to earn money to buy the bland food that gave you just enough energy to labor again tomorrow. The logistical challenge of feeding tens of thousands of men stationed in the most remote corners of the known world was monumental. The vast supply chain that stretched from the farms of Egypt or Sicily to a windswept fort in northern Britain was a marvel of Roman organization. It was also incredibly fragile. This meant that the food that actually reached a frontier legionary was often far from fresh. The grain might be months old, the salted meat even older. The quality was secondary to the quantity. As long as it was technically edible, it was considered acceptable. There were no picky eaters in the legions, because the alternative to eating what you were given was starvation. The army did not cater to individual tastes or dietary requirements. Every man, from the rawest recruit to the seasoned veteran, received his ration and was expected to make do. There was no vegetarian option, though most of the diet was vegetarian by default. There were no allergy considerations. You received your block of salt, your measure of grain, and your portion of sour wine, and you were expected to be grateful for it. The undisputed king, emperor, and god of the Roman military diet was grain. Usually wheat in the more fertile regions and barley on the tougher postings, grain provided the vast majority of a soldier's daily caloric intake. It was the fuel that powered the conquests, the foundation upon which the empire was built. Each soldier was allotted a ration of around 2 pounds of grain per day. This monotonous, unending supply of carbohydrates was the beginning, middle, and end of almost every meal he would eat for 25 years. This grain was not usually issued as clean, convenient flour. More often than not, each 8-man tent group, or contubernium, was issued whole kernels. This meant that after a long day of marching, digging, and being yelled at by their centurion, the soldiers had another chore to look forward to: milling their own flour. They would use a small, portable, rotary hand mill, or quern stone. 2 men would grind away, turning the heavy stone, slowly producing the coarse flour needed for their evening meal. It was just one more layer of exhausting labor in a life composed entirely of it. Your gourmet meal was grain again, with extra grit probably. The hand-milling process, using stones that were often of poor quality, inevitably introduced fine particles of sand and stone dust into the flour. This grit was a constant, unwelcome ingredient in every meal. It gave the food a sandy texture and, over the years, had a devastating effect on the soldiers' teeth, slowly grinding them down. Archaeological evidence from Roman burial sites often shows teeth worn flat from a lifetime of chewing on gritty, stone-ground bread. The simplest and most common way to prepare this gritty flour was to just add water and boil it into a thick porridge, known to the Romans as pulse. This was the quintessential Roman comfort food, if comfort can be defined as a warm, bland, mushy substance. It was easy to make, required minimal fuel, and filled the stomach. For a soldier shivering in a damp fort in Germania, a bowl of hot porridge, however tasteless, was a small victory against the cold, and a brief respite from the gnawing hunger in his belly. If they had the time and the means, soldiers could attempt to make bread. Without access to proper ovens or reliable yeast, however, this was rarely the light, airy loaf we might imagine. More often it was a dense, heavy, unleavened flatbread, cooked on a griddle over the fire or directly in the hot embers. The result was a tough, chewy, and often slightly burnt disc that was more a vehicle for other flavors, if there were any, than a pleasure to eat in its own right. It was essentially a cooked rock, designed to fill a hole in your stomach. For soldiers on the march, the most important food item was the bucellatum, the infamous hardtack biscuit. This was a simple flour and water biscuit that was baked twice to remove every last molecule of moisture. The resulting product was almost as hard as fired brick and was virtually immune to spoilage. A soldier could carry a supply of these biscuits for weeks without fear of them going bad. This made them the perfect military ration. Unfortunately, it also made them nearly impossible to eat. To consume a piece of hardtack, a soldier couldn't simply bite into it unless he had a deep desire to shatter his already worn-down teeth. The standard procedure was to soak the biscuit in whatever liquid was available: water, soup, or most commonly, wine. After a lengthy soaking, the biscuit would dissolve into a flavorless, pulpy mush that could be swallowed without the need for aggressive chewing. It was a grim but effective way to consume calories on the move. The drink that washed all this down was not a fine Falernian vintage. The standard issue beverage was posca. This was a practical, if unappetizing, concoction of cheap sour wine, essentially wine that had already turned to vinegar, mixed with water and sometimes herbs for flavor. Its primary purpose was not refreshment, but safety. The acidity of the vinegar helped to kill the bacteria in questionable water sources, making it safer to drink. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a water purification tablet, and it tasted about as good. Protein was a rare and valuable commodity. The most common source was salted and dried meat, usually pork, in the form of bacon. The salt acted as a preservative, allowing the meat to be stored for long periods. The downside was that the final product was incredibly salty, tough, and stringy. It would be added to stews or porridge to provide a bit of flavor and much-needed fat. but it was a far cry from a tender, juicy steak. Cheese was another vital source of protein and fat, prized for its portability and long shelf life. This would have been a hard, salty cheese likely made from sheep's or goat's milk that could withstand the rigors of a campaign. A small wedge of cheese, paired with a piece of hardtack, was a typical legionary lunch, a dry, salty, and deeply unfulfilling meal, eaten on a brief halt during a long day's march. Fresh produce was the greatest luxury of all. The standard ration rarely included fresh fruits or vegetables. A legionary's best hope for something green was whatever could be grown in a small garden plot at the fort, or what could be requisitioned, a nicer word for taken, from the local population. Onions, garlic, lentils, and beans were common supplements, adding much-needed nutrients and a welcome break from the monotony of the grain-based diet. To break the monotony, a soldier often had to rely on his own initiative. Foraging parties would be sent out to gather wild food. Depending on the location and the season, this could include berries, nuts, mushrooms, and wild greens. This was a risky business. Mistaking a poisonous plant for an edible one could be a fatal error. The men who knew their botany were some of the most valuable members of any unit. Hunting provided the rare and cherished treat of fresh meat. A successful hunt could yield a deer, a wild boar, or other game, resulting in a feast for the entire century. But hunting was time-consuming and dangerous. It required venturing deep into potentially hostile territory, far from the safety of the fort. The reward of a hot, meaty stew had to be weighed against the very real risk of being ambushed and becoming dinner for the local wildlife yourself. In more established forts, a civilian settlement, or vicus, would often spring up nearby. These settlements had taverns and food stalls, where a soldier could spend his own money to buy a welcome change from the official rations. Here he could get a better quality wine, a properly cooked piece of meat, or even some exotic imported foods. This created a clear culinary divide between the veterans with savings to spend and the new recruits who were stuck with their daily gruel. Of course, the quality of the official rations was often abysmal. The grain stored in the fort's granaries, the horea, was a constant target for pests. It was not uncommon for a soldier's flour to be infested with weevils and other insects. The salted meat could be rancid, the cheese moldy. The general attitude was to pick out the worst of the bugs, scrape off the mold, and eat it anyway. Complaining would only earn you a beating from your centurion. Hunger was a powerful motivator for lowering your standards. The precarious nature of the supply chain meant that the threat of shortages was always looming. A particularly harsh winter could block the roads with snow for weeks. A successful enemy raid could capture a vital supply convoy. In these situations, rations would be cut. The daily allotment of grain would shrink, and the men would begin to feel the gnawing pangs of true hunger. On the most isolated outposts, starvation was a very real and terrifying possibility. The most insidious threat of this limited diet was not hunger, but malnutrition. The lack of fresh fruit and vegetables, particularly those rich in vitamin C, made scurvy a constant danger, especially during long winter months when foraging was impossible. The symptoms were horrific: lethargy, bleeding gums, loose teeth, the reopening of old wounds, and, eventually, death. A legionary could be safe from the enemy's sword, only to be slowly and painfully killed by his own diet. The cumulative effect of this diet over a 25-year career was devastating. The gritty bread wore down the teeth, leading to abscesses and tooth loss. The low-fiber, high-carbohydrate diet likely caused a host of digestive problems. The lack of key vitamins and minerals would have weakened the immune system, making soldiers more susceptible to disease. The food they ate to survive was also slowly poisoning them. In the end, the food a Roman legionary ate was a perfect metaphor for his entire existence. It was functional, it was repetitive, it was devoid of pleasure, and it was designed for endurance above all else. Every meal was a reminder of his low status and his grim, joyless reality. The conquest of the world, it turns out, was fueled by bad bread, sour wine, and an ocean of porridge. It was a victory that tasted like grit and disappointment. The grand story of the Roman Empire is written in stone and marble, but but its foundation was built on something far more humble, the daily, monotonous ration of the common soldier. If you appreciate these deeper, darker, and more truthful slices of history, then make sure to secure your own rations of knowledge. Support the channel by hitting like and subscribe. Of all the grim realities that defined the life of a Roman legionary on the frontier, the most terrifying and most prolific killer was not the painted barbarian or the elusive Parthian horseman. It was an enemy far more intimate, an invisible and relentless foe that lurked in his water, his food, his barracks, and in the very air he breathed. For every soldier who met a heroic end on the tip of a spear, countless more died a slow, agonizing, and deeply unglamorous death from disease. This was the real war, the one fought not with sword and shield, but with fever and flux. The typical frontier fort, a marvel of military engineering, was also a perfect self-contained petri dish for growing and spreading pathogens. It was a crowded, bustling environment, with hundreds or even thousands of men living in incredibly close quarters. These men, drawn from every corner of the empire, brought with them their own local collection of germs, creating a rich and diverse microbial soup. In the cramped, poorly ventilated barracks, where 8 men shared a tiny room, a single cough could infect an entire unit by morning. The fort was a fortress against the enemy outside, but a breeding ground for the enemy within. The Romans are famous for their aqueducts and their understanding of hydraulics, but this advanced knowledge rarely translated to a remote frontier outpost. The fort's water supply was often drawn from a nearby river, a stream, or a simple well. This single water source was used for everything: drinking, cooking, washing clothes, and cleaning equipment. It was also, more often than not, the same body of water into which the camp's upstream waste and runoff would eventually find its way. Every sip of water was a roll of the dice with your digestive system. The chilling truth for the common soldier was this: your biggest fear wasn't a barbarian sword, it was the suspiciously muddy water you just drank. While the army understood that clear water was generally better than cloudy water, they had absolutely no concept of germ theory. The invisible microorganisms that caused cholera, typhoid, and dysentery were a complete mystery to them. They might add sour wine to their water to make it safer, a practice that helped a little due to the acidity, but it was far from a perfect solution. The real danger remained, silent and unseen in every cup. Even the Romans' most celebrated sanitary innovation, the communal latrine, was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, a large, multi-seat lavatory with running water to carry away waste was a revolutionary idea that kept the camp cleaner than it might otherwise have been. On the other hand, it was a public space where dozens of men a day shared not only pleasantries, but also every intestinal parasite and bacteria, and the infamous shared cleaning tool, a sea sponge on a stick known as a xylospongium, was a horrifically efficient way to ensure that whatever one man had, everyone soon would. The camp was also a paradise for pests, which acted as tiny 6-legged chariots for disease. The granaries, filled with tons of stored grain, were an irresistible draw for rats and mice, whose droppings and fleas could spread a host of illnesses. The latrines and waste pits were swarming with flies, which would happily move from a pile of filth to the food being prepared for the evening meal. And in the woolen cloaks and straw bedding of the soldiers themselves, lice and fleas found a warm and welcoming home, spreading illnesses like trench fever with every bite. The undisputed king of all camp diseases, the bane of every army in history until the modern era, was dysentery. Known to the Romans as the bloody flux, its symptoms were as miserable as they were deadly. It began with debilitating stomach cramps, followed by a violent and uncontrollable diarrhea that would eventually contain blood and mucus. A man in the grip of the flux was a pathetic sight, weakened by dehydration and trapped in a humiliating cycle of sickness. It could empty a man out and kill him in a matter of days, and it could spread through a garrison like wildfire. Alongside dysentery were its equally unpleasant cousins, the other great gut plagues like typhoid and cholera. These waterborne illnesses produced similar symptoms of fever, vomiting, and diarrhea, and were just as deadly. An outbreak could cripple a legion, rendering hundreds of men too weak to stand, let alone fight. A commander might find his fighting force reduced by half without a single enemy in sight. These diseases were a far greater threat to the army's operational readiness than any barbarian war party. In many regions of the empire, particularly near marshes or other areas with stagnant water, another invisible enemy ruled the air, the mosquito. The Romans didn't know that these whining insects carried malaria, which they called marsh fever, but they knew that living near swamps made people sick. The symptoms were unmistakable and debilitating. Cycles of intense bone-rattling chills, followed by a raging fever and drenching sweats. Malaria wouldn't always kill a man outright, but it would break his strength, leaving him weak, anemic, and vulnerable to other infections for the rest of his life. The constant, maddening itch of a louse-infested tunic was a universal experience for the common soldier. But lice were more than just an itchy annoyance. They were carriers of disease. Louse-borne illnesses, similar to what would later be called trench fever, were rampant. The disease brought on a high fever, severe headaches, and intense pain in the legs and back. While not as deadly as dysentery, it could incapacitate a soldier for weeks, and in a weakened state he was an easy target for more lethal secondary infections. As we've discussed before, the monotonous legionary diet was a health disaster waiting to happen. The chronic lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant that vitamin C deficiency or scurvy was a constant threat, especially during long winters or sieges. The symptoms were a horror show. A man's gums would swell and bleed, his teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would spontaneously reopen, and he would be overcome by a profound lethargy. It was a slow, painful, and entirely preventable decay. In the cold, damp, and crowded barracks, even a simple respiratory illness could become a death sentence. The common cold, passed easily from man to man, could quickly develop into pneumonia. With no antibiotics, treatment was limited to rest and prayer. A soldier with fluid filling his lungs had to rely on the strength of his own immune system, a system that was already compromised by a poor diet, constant stress, and a miserable living condition. Many men simply drowned in their own beds. The legionary's skin was in a constant state of assault. His heavy wool tunic, often damp with sweat or rain, would chafe his skin raw. His leather gear would rub and irritate. This combination of moisture, friction, and poor hygiene created the perfect environment for a host of delightful skin diseases. Rashes, boils, fungal infections like athlete's foot, and scabies were a routine part of life. The constant itching and discomfort was a form of low-grade, unending torture. Of course, the most obvious health risk was being wounded in combat. A slash from a sword or a puncture from a spear was an immediate and terrifying problem. But for a Roman soldier, the initial wound was often the least of his worries. The true danger began in the hours and days that followed, as another invisible enemy began its work: infection. In a world without any concept of bacteria or sterilization, every wound was an open invitation to infection. Dirt from the battlefield, fragments of dirty clothing, and the unwashed hands of the man treating you all introduced a host of dangerous microbes directly into your body. A soldier would watch his wound with terror, looking for the telltale signs: the angry redness, the throbbing heat, the thick, foul-smelling pus, and the thin red lines that would snake up a limb, signaling the onset of blood poisoning. When infection turned to gangrene, a man's fate was all but sealed. The tissue would begin to die, turning black and emitting a uniquely horrific smell that was a death sentence. The only hope, and it was a slim one, was amputation. This was a brutal, terrifying procedure performed on a conscious patient, but it was the only way to stop the relentless march of the dead flesh up the limb. For many, the choice was between the saw or a slow, agonizing death. The Romans, to their credit, took military medicine seriously. Every permanent fort had a valtudinarium, a dedicated hospital building. This was a revolutionary concept. It was a well-organized facility with clean wards, a surgical suite, and a dedicated medical staff. It was also, unfortunately, a place where all the sickest men in the garrison were gathered together, making it a perfect hotspot for cross-contamination and the spread of disease from one patient to another. The military doctor, or medicus, was a respected professional. Some were highly skilled surgeons with a deep practical knowledge of anatomy gained from patching up countless battlefield injuries. However, their knowledge was based on observation, not scientific understanding. They knew what to do, but they didn't know why it worked. They could set a broken bone with surprising skill, but they had no idea that the infection that followed was caused by the germs on their own hands. The surgical kits found at Roman sites are impressive, filled with tools that look remarkably modern: scalpels, hooks, forceps, catheters, and terrifying-looking bone saws. In the hands of a skilled medicus, these tools could be used to extract arrowheads, remove diseased tissue, and perform complex procedures. In the hands of a less skilled practitioner, or when used without any form of sterilization, they were little more than elaborate instruments of torture that often introduced more infections than they solved. Let us be clear about the reality of Roman surgery. There was no effective anesthesia. A soldier facing the surgeon's knife would be given a strong dose of wine, a draught of an opiate like poppy extract if he was lucky, and then he would be held down by several strong assistants. He would be wide awake and fully conscious of every cut, every probe, and every stitch. The pain would be unimaginable, and many men died from the shock of the procedure alone. If a soldier wasn't undergoing surgery, his treatment would consist of a mixture of practical herbalism and outright superstition. The Romans had a vast knowledge of plants, and some of their remedies were genuinely effective. Willow bark, for example, contains a substance similar to aspirin and was used to treat fevers and pain. However, for every effective herbal remedy, there was a dozen useless or bizarre potions and poultices made from things like animal dung, cobwebs, or crocodile teeth. The psychological impact of living in this constant state of medical peril was immense. A soldier learnt to fear a fever more than he feared a fight. He would watch his friends, strong men who had survived countless battles, be reduced to withered, wasting shells by an invisible sickness. It bred a deep sense of fatalism, a feeling that your fate was completely out of your hands. You could be the best soldier in the legion, but it wouldn't save you from a sip of bad water. So when we tally the final, grim account of a legionary's life, we must look past the battlefield. For every man who was granted a relatively quick death in the heat of combat, at least 2 or 3, and in some campaigns many more, were claimed by the silent, inglorious, and deeply unpleasant ravages of disease. They were conquered not by barbarian warriors, but by the microscopic tyrants they could neither see nor comprehend. This was the real, unsung enemy of Rome. The story of the Roman legionary is a testament to human endurance, not just against swords and spears, but against the relentless siege of pathogens. It's a dark and often disgusting part of history, but a vital one to understanding the true cost of empire. If you find this journey into the grim realities of the past compelling, we invite you to join our ranks. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy this. To understand the Roman army, one must first understand its core philosophy of motivation. It was not built on rousing speeches, appeals to patriotism, or a sense of fair play. The Roman military machine was built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated fear. The guiding principle, drilled into every recruit, was simple and brutal. A soldier must be taught to fear his own officers far more than he could ever possibly fear the enemy. This was not about building character or fostering camaraderie. It was about systematically breaking a man's will and reforging it into an instrument of reflexive, unquestioning obedience. This system of discipline through terror was something every soldier legally agreed to. Upon enlistment, he swore the sacramentum, the sacred oath of allegiance. In this oath, he not only pledged to obey his commanders and defend the emperor, but he also willingly submitted himself to the army's brutal penal code. He swore to endure any punishment, up to and including death, without complaint. In the eyes of Roman law, when a centurion beat a soldier for a minor infraction, he was simply carrying out a punishment to which that soldier had already consented. It was a contract, written in fear and signed in blood. The primary instrument of this discipline, the face of the army's authority for the common soldier, was the centurion. A centurion was a career soldier, a hardened veteran who had risen through the ranks through a combination of bravery, skill, and sheer toughness. He was the backbone of the legion, responsible for the training, morale, and performance of the 80 men under his command. He was also their chief tormentor. He was not their friend, their counselor, or their mentor. He was their absolute master, with the power of punishment literally in his hands. Every centurion carried a symbol of his office, a simple stick of dried grapevine wood called a vetus. This was not a decorative swagger stick or a mere badge of rank. The vetus was the single most common tool of punishment in the Roman army. It was a constant, physical reminder of the centurion's authority to inflict pain. For a legionary on the frontier, the sight of his centurion's vine staff was a far more immediate and persistent threat than any distant barbarian tribe. It was the tool used to fine-tune the human machinery of the legion, one painful blow at a time. The daily life of a soldier was a constant effort to avoid the sting of the vitis. Your boss wasn't just tough, he literally carried a stick to beat you with. The vine staff was applied liberally for a galaxy of minor offenses. Was your armor not polished to a perfect shine? Was your salute a little sloppy? Were you a second too slow in responding to an order? Did you make a mistake during a drill? All of these were punishable by a swift, sharp application of the centurion's stick. This casual, routine brutality created an environment of constant, low-level anxiety, ensuring that every soldier was always on his guard. Some centurions became infamous throughout the army for their enthusiastic use of the vine staff. Historical sources tell of one particularly zealous officer who earned the nickname Sido Altaram, which translates to, "Fetch me another." This was what he would roar when he inevitably broke his stick on the back of a disciplined soldier, demanding a replacement so he could continue the beating without interruption. This grimly humorous nickname reveals the culture of the centurionate. A reputation for extreme harshness was not something to be ashamed of, but a mark of professional pride. Of course, the punishments could be far more varied and creative than a simple beating. For minor offenses like sloppiness or laziness, a common punishment was the assignment of extra duties. This meant more hours on guard duty, the delightful task of cleaning the camp latrines, or other physically demanding and humiliating chores. This was discipline through exhaustion and degradation, designed to make a soldier so sick of the punishment that he would never repeat the offense. The Roman army also understood the power of financial punishment. A soldier who lost or damaged a piece of his equipment could be issued a pecunia multae, a fine docked directly from his pay. Given that a soldier's salary was already being reduced to pay for his food and gear, any further fines could be a significant hardship. It was a brutally effective way of teaching a man the value of his equipment, ensuring he took better care of his state-issued property than he did of his own skin. Public humiliation was another powerful tool in the centurion's arsenal. A soldier might be forced to stand at attention all day in front of the Principia, the headquarters building, for all his comrades to see. Sometimes this punishment would involve being dressed in a ridiculous manner, or being forced to hold a heavy piece of turf, a symbolic representation of the rampart he had failed to build correctly. In a society that prized honor and reputation, this kind of public shaming could be a punishment more painful than any physical blow. Punishment could also be collective. If a unit performed poorly in a drill or showed a lack of spirit, a centurion could punish the entire group. A common method was to alter their rations. Instead of receiving the standard ration of wheat, the disgraced unit would be issued barley, which was considered animal feed and made a coarse, unpleasant bread. Their rations of wine or meat could also be cut. This fostered a sense of group accountability, as the 9 men who performed well would be sure to express their displeasure to the one man whose mistake caused them all to eat horse food for a week. For more serious offenses, such as insubordination or striking an officer, the punishment escalated to flogging. This was a much more severe and formal affair than a casual beating with the vetus. The condemned soldier would be stripped and tied to a stake in front of the assembled legion. He would then be beaten with a flagrum, a vicious type of whip that could be fitted with pieces of bone or metal to inflict maximum damage. This public spectacle served as a terrifying warning to anyone else who might be considering stepping out of line. The Roman military code recognized a number of capital crimes, offenses for which the only punishment was death. These included desertion, mutiny, treason, and displaying cowardice in the face of the enemy. But for a soldier on the dangerous frontier, perhaps the most unforgivable sin of all was falling asleep while on guard duty. A single sleeping sentry could compromise the security of the entire garrison, allowing an enemy raiding party to slip inside and slaughter everyone in their beds. For this offense there was no mercy. The punishment for falling asleep on watch or for abandoning your post was the fustuarium. This was a horrific and deeply personal form of execution. The condemned soldier would be brought before his assembled comrades. A military tribune would pronounce the sentence, and then lightly tap the offender with a stick. This tap was the signal. At that moment, the man's own tentmates, the men he lived and fought alongside, would descend upon him with clubs, fustays, and stones, beating him to death. If he managed to escape the camp, he was declared an outlaw and could be hunted down and killed by anyone. The fustuarium was a chillingly effective piece of psychological engineering. By making the soldiers themselves the executioners, the army forced them to become active participants in the enforcement of its brutal discipline. It sent a clear message: the safety of the group depends on the vigilance of the individual, and the group itself will violently purge anyone who threatens that safety. It was a brutal but effective way to ensure that every man on the ramparts stayed wide awake through the long dark nights. But the most infamous and terrifying punishment in the Roman military arsenal was reserved for situations of mass cowardice or mutiny. When an entire unit had disgraced itself, the commanders could resort to the brutal practice of decimation. The word itself simply means the removal of a tenth, but the reality was a nightmare of cold, calculated terror. It was the ultimate expression of collective punishment, a way to restore discipline through a random yet deeply personal application of violence. The process of decimation was a chillingly simple lottery of death. The disgraced cohort or legion would be divided into groups of 10. Each group of 10 soldiers, who were likely friends and comrades who had fought side by side for years, would then be forced to draw lots. One of the lots would be marked for death. The man who drew the short straw was then set upon by the other 9 men in his group, who were compelled to beat their friend to death with clubs. It was a 1 in 10 chance of being murdered by your closest colleagues. The psychological devastation of decimation is hard to comprehend. Imagine the terror of that lottery, the sickening feeling of relief if you drew a safe lot, and the absolute horror of watching your friends beat one of your own to death. The 9 survivors were not let off the hook. They were further punished and disgraced. They would be forced to camp outside the main fort's defenses, a place of extreme vulnerability, and would be fed barley instead of wheat. They were marked men, living with the shame of their unit's cowardice and the trauma of having been made state-sanctioned murderers. Did this extreme brutality actually work? It is a question historians still debate. On the one hand, it created an army that was, for the most part, astonishingly disciplined. A Roman soldier knew with absolute certainty that no matter how terrifying the enemy charging at him might be, the punishment for running away would be far worse, and it would be delivered by his own side. This grim calculation often drove legions to perform incredible feats of bravery, choosing the possibility of a clean death in battle over the certainty of a brutal execution. However, this system was also wide open to abuse. A centurion who was cruel, sadistic, or simply having a bad day could make life an unlivable hell for the men under his command. A common soldier had virtually no recourse against his officers. Complaints were likely to be dismissed, or worse, result in even more severe punishments for insubordination. The line between enforcing discipline and engaging in pure tyrannical bullying was incredibly thin, and it was crossed on a daily basis. There were times when this brutal discipline backfired spectacularly. A legion pushed too far by a cruel commander or by impossible demands could be tipped over the edge into open mutiny. This was the ultimate crisis for a Roman general. A mutiny had to be put down swiftly and ruthlessly to prevent it from spreading to other units. But the act of punishing a mutinous legion, often through mass executions or decimation, could further poison morale and breed a deep simmering resentment that might last for years. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of violence. For the individual soldier, there was no easy way out of this brutal system. The penalty for desertion was death, and it was a promise the army always kept. A captured deserter could expect a particularly gruesome end. He might be crucified along a major road as a warning to others, or he might be thrown to wild beasts in the arena for the entertainment of the masses. Knowing the horrific fate that awaited them, most soldiers chose to endure the misery of service rather than risk the certainty of a horrific death. Over a 25-year career, this constant atmosphere of fear and the regular application of physical violence took a massive toll on a soldier's body and mind. He lived in a state of perpetual stress, knowing that a simple mistake could result in a painful beating or worse. He was a cog in a machine that was fueled by fear, a system that valued his obedience far more than his well-being. It was a long, hard, and brutal education in the Roman way of war. In the final analysis, the Roman legionary was not just a soldier. He was a survivor of one of the most demanding and unforgiving institutional systems ever created. He was motivated not just by the abstract concepts of glory or duty, but by the very real and immediate fear of the vine staff, the flogging post, and the executioner's club. The discipline of the legion was the invisible force that held the shield wall together, the silent threat that drove men to charge into a hail of arrows. It was a harsh school, and its lessons were written in scars. The Roman army's success was built on a foundation of discipline, but that discipline was built on a foundation of pain and fear. It's a dark but essential part of understanding how this empire was able to conquer and control such a vast portion of the world. The story of Rome is not for the faint of heart. If you appreciate this unflinching look at the past and want to support our mission to uncover more of it, help us grow, please like and subscribe. The Roman Empire was built by soldiers, but it was paid for with their lives, and not just their lives on the battlefield, but the long, slow sacrifice of their entire adult existence. When a young man of 18 or 20 swore the military oath, he wasn't just signing up for a career. He was effectively being sentenced to a quarter-century of exile. He was saying goodbye to his family, his friends, his home, and any semblance of a normal personal life. For the next 25 years, the legion would be his only family, and the remote, miserable frontier would be his only home. In our modern world, we think of military service as including periods of leave, of holidays spent back home with loved ones. This concept would have been utterly alien to a Roman legionary on a frontier post. Official leave, known as comitus, was not a right, it was an exceptionally rare privilege. It was granted almost exclusively for official army business or in the most extreme of personal emergencies, and even then, it was entirely at the discretion of a commander who had little incentive to grant it. The army needed bodies on the wall, not enjoying a vacation in Italy. Even if a soldier were one of the lucky few to be granted leave, the journey itself was a monumental undertaking. A legionary stationed on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britannia or on the Euphrates River in Syria was thousands of miles from his home in Spain or Gaul or Italy. The journey back would take weeks, if not months, of arduous and dangerous travel. It was also expensive, and a soldier would have to pay his own way. By the time he finally reached his ancestral village, he would have spent a fortune and most of his allotted time with the dreadful prospect of the long journey back already looming over him. The crushing reality of this separation is hard to comprehend. A son who left his family's farm at 18 would not be seen again until he was a 43-year-old man, hardened and weathered by decades of brutal service. In that time, his parents would almost certainly have passed away. The siblings he grew up with would now be middle-aged strangers with families of their own. The friends he once knew would be gone or changed beyond recognition. He was a ghost returning to a world that had moved on without him, a past he could never reclaim. The only fragile thread connecting a soldier to his old life was the Roman postal system. A legionary could write letters home and, if he was lucky, receive them. But this was not a swift or reliable service. A letter from the frontier could take many months to reach its destination, carried by a slow and complex network of ships, wagons, and runners. The news it contained would be tragically out of date upon arrival. A soldier might receive a letter describing a family celebration that happened 6 months ago, or worse, learn of a parent's death long after they had been buried. Over the long, empty years, this connection to home would inevitably fray and wither. The shared experiences that bind families together were absent. The soldier's life was a litany of guard duty, patrols, and discipline, a world his family could not possibly understand, and their lives of farming, marriage, and local festivals would seem increasingly distant and irrelevant to him. Slowly but surely, the frontier became his only reality. He was a man without a past, marooned in the grim present of his posting. With his old family effectively gone, the legionnaire was forced to create a new one. This new family was his concubanium, the 7 other men with whom he shared a tiny, cramped room in the barracks. These were the men he saw every single day, from the moment he woke to the moment he slept. He ate with them, marched with them, trained with them, and fought beside them. They were his constant, inescapable companions. This enforced intimacy was a world away from a modern social life. There was no privacy, no personal space, no escape. Your social life consisted of your tent mates, and they mostly smelled like unwashed leather. You knew who snored, who talked in their sleep, and who had the worst taste in jokes. It was a brotherhood born not of choice, but of shared, relentless misery. These bonds, forged in the crucible of frontier life, were incredibly strong. You learned to trust the men in your combinarium with your life, because you had to. On patrol, the man to your left and the man to your right were the only things keeping you from a barbarian spear. You would share your rations with a hungry comrade and help carry him back to the fort if he was wounded. These were not friendships based on shared hobbies or pleasant conversations. They were deep, functional relationships built on the bedrock of mutual survival. The main currency of this social life was storytelling and complaining. In the long, dark, and boring evenings, the men would gather in their gloomy barracks and share tales. They would talk about their homes, embellish their past exploits, and complain. They complained endlessly. They complained about the food, the weather, the officers, the locals, the pay, and the sheer mind-numbing boredom of it all. This collective venting was a vital psychological release valve, a way to make their shared suffering more bearable. Of course, forcing 8 men to live in a shoebox for years on end was also a recipe for conflict. The same cramped quarters that forged bonds also bred tensions. Arguments could erupt over anything: a disputed dice game, a stolen piece of cheese, an unpaid debt, or simply the grating annoyance of one man's constant sniffing. These petty squabbles could fester in the claustrophobic environment of the barracks, sometimes escalating into brawls that would earn everyone involved a beating from the centurion. Ultimately, the contubanarium was a soldier's primary support system. In a world of loneliness and fear, they provided a sense of belonging. They were a shield against the profound isolation of a frontier posting. They might not have chosen each other, but they were all in the same miserable boat, and they learned to row together. For many soldiers, these 7 other men were the only meaningful human connection they would have for the better part of their adult lives. This social world was rigidly stratified. A common legionary would socialize almost exclusively with other common legionaries. The auxiliary soldiers, the non-citizens recruited from the provinces, tended to stick to their own units and their own languages, and the officers, the centurions, tribunes, and the camp prefect, were a class apart. They lived in separate, more spacious quarters and rarely mingled with the enlisted men except to issue orders or punishments. It was a tough, hyper-masculine world where any display of emotional vulnerability was treated as a weakness. A soldier suffering from homesickness or despair had nowhere to turn. Admitting his sadness would only open him up to ridicule from his comrades or punishment from his officers for having a poor attitude. The only acceptable way to deal with emotional pain was to suppress it, to bury it under a thick layer of cynical humor, or to try and drown it in a cup of cheap, sour posca. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of this social isolation was the official ban on marriage. For most of Roman history, a legionary was legally forbidden from marrying while in service. The logic of the state was cold and simple. A wife and children were a distraction. The emperor wanted his soldiers to be wedded only to the legion, their loyalty undivided. He wanted a mobile, unencumbered fighting force, not an army tied down by domestic concern. But human nature cannot be legislated away. While soldiers could not legally marry, they could, and did, form relationships. The only venue for this was the vicus, the sprawling civilian settlement that inevitably grew up outside the walls of any permanent fort. The vicus was a bustling, chaotic place, filled with merchants, craftsmen, tavern keepers and local women who were drawn to the relative economic stability of the Roman garrison. Here, in the taverns and streets of the vicus, soldiers would meet local women and form long-term, committed relationships. These women were their wives in every sense but the legal one. They would set up households together, share their lives and have children. These relationships were often stable and loving, a small pocket of warmth and domesticity in a cold and brutal world. They were an unofficial but vital part of frontier life. These unions resulted in a generation of children born in the shadow of the forts, the children of the regiment. These children grew up in a unique cultural limbo. Their fathers were Roman soldiers, but their mothers were often from local barbarian tribes, Britons, Gauls, or Germans. They grew up speaking Latin as well as the local tongue, their identity forged on the very fault line of the empire. For many of the boys, the most obvious career path was to follow their fathers into the army. The entire existence of these frontier families was legally precarious. Since the soldier was not officially married, his partner had no legal rights. If he died in battle or from disease, she had no claim to his property or his death benefits. His children were considered illegitimate in the eyes of Roman law. For much of the imperial period, this meant they did not automatically inherit their father's Roman citizenship, the most valuable social and legal commodity in the ancient world. They were a family built on a foundation of legal uncertainty. The army's official stance on these families was to pretend they didn't exist. The marriage ban remained firmly in place. In practice, however, most commanders adopted a pragmatic "don't ask, don't tell" policy. A wise commander knew that a soldier with a local family was often more stable, better behaved, and less likely to desert. As long as a man's domestic life did not interfere with his military duties, the officers were usually content to look the other way. The true heartbreak of this arrangement often came when a legion was permanently reassigned. A unit could be ordered to move from Britain to the Danube frontier, a journey of hundreds and hundreds of miles. A soldier with a local family faced an impossible choice. He could obey orders and abandon the woman and children he had lived with for 10 or 15 years, knowing he would likely never see them again, or he could attempt to uproot them from their home and drag them across the continent on a long and perilous journey, with no guarantee of what their life would be like at the other end. And what of the soldier who followed the rules? The man who for 25 years avoided any deep emotional attachments, who shunned the women of the vicus, and who remained loyal only to the eagle standard. He would survive his service, receive his honorable discharge and his plot of land, and find himself in his mid-40s, utterly alone. He had no wife, no children, and no experience of a normal civilian life. His reward for a lifetime of disciplined service was a profoundly lonely old age. The ultimate cost of Roman military service was not measured in blood, but in the quiet, unrecorded loneliness of 100,000 lives. For 25 years, during the prime of their manhood, legionaries were denied the fundamental human experiences of a stable home, a legal family, and the simple comfort of a loving touch. They were defenders of a civilization from which they were almost completely disconnected. The Roman Empire was secured by legions of men who were masters of war but strangers to love. They were surrounded by their comrades but were, in the ways that truly matter, profoundly and desperately alone. Their story is a somber reminder that the foundations of empire are often built with the invisible bricks of human loneliness. If this deeper look into the past keeps you engaged, then help our community grow. Keep the history coming, like and subscribe. For 25 years, a Roman legionary endured. He endured the back-making labor, the monotonous diet, the brutal discipline, the miserable weather, the soul-crushing boredom, and the ever-present fear of a violent death. Through it all, one single shining hope kept him going, the promise of retirement. It was the light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel. The day he received his honesta missio, his honorable discharge, was the day his life would finally begin. After a quarter-century of servitude, he would finally be a free man, rewarded for his loyalty with security and respect. At least, that was the sales pitch. The day of discharge was a momentous occasion. After 25 years of service, a man in his mid-40s would stand on parade one last time. He would be formally released from his military oath. He would receive his diploma, not a paper certificate, but 2 small bronze tablets hinged together. This document was legal proof of his service, certifying his rights and privileges as a veteran of the Roman army. For the auxiliary soldier, this was the ultimate prize, as it conferred upon him and his descendants the coveted prize of full Roman citizenship. This diploma was a powerful legal document. It gave the veteran the right of connubium, the right to legally marry. This meant the unofficial wife he may have lived with for 2 decades on the frontier was now, finally, his legal spouse. His children, previously illegitimate in the eyes of the state, were now legally his and were recognized as Roman citizens. On paper, it was the perfect happy ending. The moment a soldier could finally begin a normal family life, his long years of sacrifice finally paying off, and at the core of the retirement package, the premia militiae, was the financial reward for his long service. This usually came in one of 2 forms: a lump sum of cash or a plot of land to farm. This system, established by the Emperor Augustus, was a revolutionary concept in military affairs. However, the Roman state often found it difficult to actually fund its pension plan. The imperial treasury was frequently stretched thin, and there were years when retiring veterans were left waiting, their promised reward maddeningly out of reach. Politics and economics, it turned out, could be just as dangerous as any barbarian. Assuming the state had the resources, the retiring soldier was presented with his 2 generous options. He could take a one-time cash payout, which was a substantial sum, equivalent to about 12 years of his basic salary, or he could opt for the more traditional reward, a plot of land, a chance to become a farmer and live out his days as a respectable landowner. Both options sounded like a dream come true for a man who had spent his life in poverty and servitude. Both, however, were riddled with cruel and hidden pitfalls. Before we even consider the reward, we must consider the man receiving it. The average veteran at the point of discharge was not a vigorous man in the prime of his life. He was a 40-something wreck. His body, the property of the Roman army for 25 years, had been used up. His back ached, his joints were a ruin of arthritis from endless marching, and his teeth were worn down from a lifetime of gritty bread. He was likely covered in scars, and he carried the invisible wounds of chronic diseases and psychological trauma. He was, in short, poorly equipped to start a new and physically demanding civilian life. Let's consider the cash option. To a man who had earned a meager salary his entire life, the lump sum of 3,000 denarii must have seemed like an unimaginable fortune. It was more money than he had ever seen in one place. The problem was, he had absolutely no experience in managing such a sum. Many veterans, unaccustomed to wealth and suddenly free from the army's rigid discipline, squandered their payout on wine, gambling, and poor business ventures, finding themselves broke within a year or 2. The more traditional and often more highly esteemed option was the land grant. This was the classic Roman dream: to own a piece of land, to be your own master, to live off the fruits of your own labor. This was the ideal that had fueled the Republic. The veteran, having spent his life defending the empire, would now get his own small piece of it. It was a reward that offered not just subsistence, but also status and dignity. It was a beautiful dream that would, for most, curdle into a nightmarish reality. You survived. Congrats. Here's a swampy plot of land near angry barbarians. Enjoy your retirement. The simple, brutal truth was that all the good, fertile, conveniently located land in the empire had been snapped up centuries ago by wealthy senators and aristocrats. The land that the state had available to give to its veterans was, almost without exception, the marginal, undesirable land that nobody else wanted. It might be a rocky hillside, a mosquito-infested swamp, or an arid patch of desert. To make matters worse, these plots of land were often located in the very frontier regions where the veteran had just served. The state would establish a new veteran settlement or colonia in a recently conquered or volatile area. The logic was simple. These settlements, populated by trained, experienced soldiers, would act as a permanent military reserve, a defensive buffer zone that would help to Romanize and pacify the region. In effect, The veteran's retirement was just a different kind of military posting. This meant that a veteran's new neighbors were often the very same tribesmen who had been trying to kill him for the past 2.5 decades. The key difference was that now he was a civilian. He had no fort walls to hide behind, no organized patrols for protection. He was an isolated farmer, a representative of the hated Roman occupiers, living on land that had likely been confiscated from the local tribes. His peaceful retirement was to be lived out under the constant threat of a revenge raid. The land grant from the state was just that, a grant of land. It did not come with a farmhouse, a plow, a pair of oxen, or a bag of seed. The veteran was expected to use his own savings, whatever meager amount he had managed to scrape together over his career, to purchase all the necessary equipment and livestock to start his farm from scratch. Many veterans simply did not have the capital to do this, and their dream of farming died before they had even planted their first seed. Let's assume a veteran got his land and his equipment. He now faced the reality of the work itself. Farming is a physically demanding, back-breaking profession. Our veteran, with his chronic injuries and worn-out body, was in no shape to clear rocky fields, plow heavy soil, and perform the endless repetitive tasks of an agricultural life. He had been trained to be a soldier, not a farmer. Many found that they simply could not cope with the physical demands of their new profession. Life in a colonia was a strange, artificial existence. It was a town populated almost entirely by middle-aged, grumpy, ex-military men and their families. It was a community bound together by shared experience, but it was also a place rife with the same tensions and hierarchies of army life. And their duty was never truly over. In times of crisis, these veterans were expected to take up their arms once more and form a local militia to defend the frontier. Their retirement came with a permanent reservist clause. Faced with poor land, a lack of capital, physical ailments, and the constant threat of attack, it is no surprise that many veterans failed as farmers. They would struggle for a few years, fall deeper and deeper into debt, and eventually be forced to sell their precious plot of land to a wealthy local landowner for a fraction of its true value. Having lost both their pension and their dream, these failed veterans would often drift to the nearest large city, joining the vast, anonymous ranks of the urban poor. We should acknowledge that some veterans did succeed. A soldier who was lucky enough to receive a decent plot of land, who was smart and frugal with his money, and whose body had not been completely destroyed by his service, could make a success of it. He could build a prosperous farm, raise his family in relative comfort, and become a respected elder in his community. These men were the poster boys for the Roman retirement system. But they were the exception, not the rule. Beyond the physical and financial challenges, the veteran faced a host of invisible psychological wounds. For 25 years he had lived in a world of extreme violence, rigid discipline, and constant fear. What we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder must have been rampant. Nightmares, flashbacks, paranoia, and a difficulty in controlling their anger were the unseen scars that many veterans carried with them into civilian life. After a quarter-century of being told what to do every minute of every day, the freedom of civilian life could be disorienting and even terrifying. In the army, your meals, your duties, your entire schedule was dictated by your superiors. In civilian life, you had to make your own decisions. For a man who had not had to think for himself since he was a teenager, this newfound autonomy could be a crushing burden. Many struggled to adapt, unable to cope without the rigid structure of the Legion. The veteran was often a man apart, a stranger in his own society. He had experienced things that his civilian neighbors could never comprehend. His worldview had been shaped by the harsh realities of the frontier. He might find the concerns of civilian life, local politics, business disputes, social niceties, to be trivial and meaningless. This social disconnect could lead to a profound sense of alienation, leaving the veteran feeling just as isolated at home as he had been in his lonely outpost. For the veteran, who now had a legal family, the challenges were different. He was now the head of a household, a husband to a woman he had only ever known in the shadow of the barracks, and a father to children who saw him as a distant, intimidating figure. He was often emotionally scarred and ill-equipped to provide the warmth and affection of a normal family life. He had been trained to be a soldier, not a husband or a father. For the veteran who had followed the rules, avoided attachments, and now found himself alone, the future was even bleaker. He was a man in his 40s with no family, no social connections, and no skills other than those of a soldier. He might find work as a security guard, a bouncer, or even a mercenary, but the prospects for a comfortable old age were slim. He was a man adrift, his purpose in life having been fulfilled, with nothing but empty years stretching out ahead of him. Politically, large groups of disgruntled, impoverished, and armed veterans were a recurring nightmare for the Roman state. They were a volatile element in society, easily swayed by populist politicians who promised to address their grievances. Several of Rome's bloody civil wars were sparked or sustained by ambitious generals who mobilized these unhappy veterans, turning the very men who had defended the empire into a force that threatened to tear it apart. In the final, grim accounting, the Roman military retirement plan was, for most, a cruel joke. It was a reward that was often just another form of hardship, a final chapter in a long book of suffering. The state demanded a man's youth, his health, and his spirit. In return, it gave him a diploma, a pittance, and a plot of useless land in a dangerous place. It was a transaction that was, like everything else in a legionary's life, brutally and fundamentally unfair. The Roman legionary was a tool, an instrument of state policy, and like any tool, once it had been used up, blunted and broken by decades of hard service, it was discarded. The promise of a peaceful retirement was the final piece of propaganda in a career built on false promises. The veteran was left to face his final years not with the honor and security he had earned, but with the familiar companions of poverty, pain, and loneliness. His war was never truly over. The story of the Roman legionary is a long and often depressing one, a testament to the incredible hardships that human beings can be forced to endure. It's a history that is dark, dull, and deeply human. If you've stuck with us on this long march into the past, then you are a true veteran of this channel. Don't be a historical recluse. Like and subscribe. We have marched a long and miserable road together through the life of a Roman legionary. We began with the gleaming image of propaganda, the disciplined, conquering hero of Rome, and have spent our time systematically dismantling that myth, replacing it with a grim and gritty reality. The story of the man on the frontier was not one of triumphant battles and glorious parades. It was a story of endurance. It was a quiet epic of survival against a host of relentless enemies: boredom, weather, disease, and despair. These men were the anonymous grind that powered Rome's expansion, the forgotten foundation upon which the empire was built. They were forged from the raw material of desperation, young men who chose the certainty of military hardship over the uncertainty of poverty. They signed away a quarter-century of their lives, lured by promises of stability and a plot of land, a dream that would, for most, prove to be a cruel mirage. They took an oath that bound them in body and spirit, willingly subjecting themselves to a system designed to erase their individuality and remold them into obedient parts of a vast, unthinking machine. Their first lesson was that their life was no longer their own. That machine was maintained by fear. The school of the legionary was a harsh one, where the primary teaching tool was the centurion's vine staff. We have seen how brutal, arbitrary, and constant punishment was. We have seen how a soldier was taught to fear his own officers far more than any barbarian, how he was conditioned to choose the uncertainty of battle over the certainty of a flogging or worse. This was not a band of brothers united by love of country. It was a chain gang united by a shared terror of their wardens. Their daily life was a masterclass in monotony. They were trained to be killing machines, only to spend the vast majority of their days as manual laborers and watchmen. They were glorified ditch diggers, expert walkers, and professional starers at trees. Their home was a cramped, smelly room in a drafty fort. Their social life consisted of the 7 other miserable men in their tent, and their diet was a repetitive cycle of gritty porridge and tooth-shattering biscuits, all washed down with sour, vinegary wine. Their lives were less glory, more grime, a truly unglamorous existence. The enemies they faced were numerous, and the barbarian warrior was often the least of their worries. They fought a daily war against a climate that was actively trying to kill them. from the freezing, bone-chilling damp of a British winter to the searing, skin-cracking heat of a Syrian summer. They fought a war against an army of invisible pathogens in their own camps, where a sip of bad water was more likely to kill them than an enemy's spear, and they fought the local tribes, who were not a noble foe lining up for a glorious battle, but an annoying, unpredictable, and deadly presence that specialized in raids, theft, and terror. Amidst this world of hardship, the soldier was profoundly alone. He was a man without a home, separated by thousands of miles and many months of travel from a family he would likely never see again. He was legally forbidden from marrying, forced into unofficial relationships that left his partner and children without rights or security. His only true companions were his fellow sufferers in the barracks, his connection to the very civilization he was defending reduced to the occasional out-of-date letter. And after 25 years of this, if he was one of the lucky few to survive it all, what was his great reward? It was the final cruel joke in a long and tragic comedy. It was often a plot of useless land in a dangerous place, given to a man whose body was too broken to work it. His retirement was not a peaceful sunset. It was simply the beginning of a new struggle, a final chapter of poverty and pain for a man who had already given everything. So, as you drift to sleep, remember the cold feet, the bad food, and the endless patrols of Rome's forgotten guardians. Remember the man standing on a windswept wall, dreaming of a home he would never see again, his gut aching from bad porridge and his spirit slowly eroded by the sheer, grinding monotony of it all. Be grateful for climate control, modern plumbing, and a job that doesn't involve daily mortal peril, because a frontier legionary's life? That truly, hilariously, tragically sucked. Thanks for listening tonight, and may your dreams be peaceful and your history lessons profoundly dull.